100%, yeah. Just a screen. Hi guys, can any of you hear me?
I'm just turned up the volume just to hear.
Okay, yeah, just go ahead and talk and then we'll, not sure. Showing
I'd say boost yourself up just like a little bit.
Yeah, okay.
Perfect. I'm going to try and move my microphone just slightly away from my face. Let me finish this post on YouTube really quick.
Hey, what's up? Darth Aces 198. Are you able to hear me okay? As soon as he's able, Sleepezi will start talking too. But I punched him in the throat earlier and so he's still recovering. So for everyone in the chat room, welcome to chapter 12's heavy theory discussion. We are going to be spoiling everything. If it's a compilation title and it has an ending, we'll probably talk about it. We will be getting into all the elements of chapter 12, which is the plate fall. Spoiler alert, the plate falls. So we're going to talk about that. This, of course, has some real weight. Oh, 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 hey, Sleepezi. How
How's
are
it
you?
going?
Can everybody
Hey,
hear
Darth.
Sleepezi?
Nice to see you joining us. How have you been? How's your day going so far? Nothing much, dude. Just taking it easy today. We got chapter 12 right coming up,
Oh yeah.
so that's gonna be fun. There's a
Um,
lot of stuff just in this one chapter that's pretty awesome to talk about. Pretty juicy chapter.
Pretty
So
juicy chapter indeed. And so, his day is great so far. So, if anybody has any difficulties hearing, or they're drowned out by the game, or our voices are uneven, please let us know in the chat, um, and and we will adjust as soon as the chat catches up to us. There is a discrepancy, but that's just to be expected. Um, Real quick, so this is a hard mode, no healing run. Um, I will try my best to get through it as quickly as possible without any restarts, um, many wipes, that is. But you know, I'm only a mere mortal. I will be, especially if it is required to progress the narrative so that we can all experience Sleepezy's unending wisdom about certain scenes. I'll heal between fights, but in terms of the actual combat, there's some really fun mechanical stuff in this chapter that we can play around with. I am going to make exceptions to the no healing rule in the first fight just because I want to show off a goofy mechanic.
Oh, that's fun.
And and so I like Narwhal. Just made a point that your art is pretty cool. So FYI, Sleepezi, your art is pretty cool.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah. That's actually where I started, like before like video making. I was an artist first.
Oh
So,
really? I didn't know
um
that.
yeah, I actually that was what I've been doing for most of my life. So, but then somewhere down the line I just got like super obsessed with like story stuff. It's fun making drawings, but like having like stories attached to like the art was always interesting.
Sure,
So,
yeah. Yeah, that makes total sense.
and
Okay.
thank you, by the way. Appreciate you guys watching the vids at all. So it's just cool to sit down with you guys. And it's really awesome to sit down with Baby Seal here because um, we've been talking for the last couple days now, and just like a lot of interesting stuff like to go over and stuff like that. So um, something that I know that there's like I'm gonna full screen this because I want to see what's going on here, but there's a couple things that are going to be happening here that I did want to like note. So just based off of descriptions of these chapters, mostly Biggs's death is not signified because obviously he lives at the end, but Jesse is also kind of has like not a definitive sort of death like statement in the chapter description. They say that we lose her, so you could kind of they don't just come out and say it just because if they ever want her to show up again, I'd imagine you can just write that a different way. But for my book, I would say that she's probably gone. I know that some people really wanted her to like stick around. There was like a huge thing about like the big the golden saucer. Uh, I don't know where that came from, but it would be neat to see her at that point. But
Well, I think because she was, the princess in the Golden Saucer play.
right,
Yeah, but I do think it's like people see the gloves and the and the bandana next to Biggs. You know, the
right at
gloves
the
that are
end.
clearly Jesse's and the bandana that's also clearly Jesse's, and say maybe that means she's alive. But to me, it seems like nah. That seems more like she's for sure dead. Like
It's almost
those
like
are the mementos of her. Yeah.
right, that,
Um.
and also just based off of that, uh, just the idea of expanding that character, like Biggs's character, into like more, you know, a deeper sense of inclusion in the story. It would be interesting just to like have that mental struggle of like, okay, so this is what it all led to. You guys like did this bombing run and got super involved in helping the planet, and what did it lead to? It led to like the death of like your friends essentially from his knowledge, right? And
Right.
so seeing what happens towards what will happen to him at the end. And I haven't looked at this scene in a while, but somebody pointed out to me that it looks like Biggs has lost his arm, but I need to look at that again.
Yeah, and you mentioned that to me too, and I've heard it a few times. I don't. I mean, he's got one side considerably more bandaged, like his entire shoulder is bandaged, and then it's bandaged down to his arm. But both arms still appear to be under the sheets or under the
Okay.
bed, the blankets, and so a lot of people have like looked at the shading underneath the blanket and decided that one holds an arm and one doesn't, and uh, I think it's possible, but I wouldn't bet like $20 on it.
Jesse
Um,
shows up in the play that you have to partake in with Cloud in the OG date scene.
yeah, that's what he's saying is, or TRD Tercel 92. What they are saying is the common sort of like theory that when
Oh, okay.
yeah, not that she actually does in the OG.
The only sort of sense of like lore that I've experienced as far as like outside of like remake in terms of compilation when it is in regard to like Jesse Biggs and Wedge, is we were talking about this a little bit last night, but in Dirge of Cerberus, there's this group called the WRO, right, which is like trying pretty much like an avalanche on like a much larger scale, run by Reeve, um, and
Oh, I guess so, but it is
it's not like a deacon. It's not like a terrorist organization. It's more like a defender of like the planet,
it's more
sort
a
of like.
rebranding of Shinra.
I guess yeah, you could see it that way.
Well, that's what it's big, and I know this is like heavy stupid lore, but um, the kids are all right. A Turk side story talks about when Evan needs to get fuel, he realizes that he has two choices. He's told this by Cloud, and Cloud tells him, "Well, you can either get it from." Um, oh, hi, Botanical. Nice to see you again. He can either get it from Don Corneo or the new brand of Shinra, World
Okay, so he states
Regenesis.
that it's connected.
But
That's
again,
awesome.
but again, it's something that when we were talking with our mutual friend last
Otto.
night, we kind of there is an inherent danger in taking somebody's um, something that is stated as somebody's perception as canon, like because it is clearly Cloud's opinion that that's what it is, not
Well, I
you
do
know
think that that
yeah,
angle, though, like what you're saying is absolutely true. Is
yeah.
that like just because somebody's perception of like this doesn't necessarily mean it's canon, but
This one's pretty
that one seems pretty solid to me as
yeah,
far as like, and especially just given their background, and who they're involved with in the Kids Are Alright.
yeah,
Like, and also we know for the most part that WRO is funded by Rufus,
yeah,
so that that all kind of connects to like maybe like even the public's perception of the WRO, um, which would be an interesting perspective to have.
Right.
Just because the only real action that we see WRO take in like DOC is it's pretty it's all genuinely good like stuff that they're trying to accomplish. Like they're trying to like stop deep ground, all this other stuff, helping out Vincent and all this other stuff. But the reason I brought up DLC to begin with is because we know that either it's Biggs or Wedge, and I think there's got to be something in there that makes it more likely that it's like Wedge's um, brother or sorry sister is actually an agent of WRO, and Vincent actually runs into her towards the end of the game. But what we were discussing last night, and something that I thought was just an interesting detail, is that Wedge in I think the Ultimania for remake is stated to have a lot of like one of his specialties is that he's able to kind of communicate to conflicting groups of and
Right.
they don't specify the groups, but that's what makes him a valuable member of this group of Avalanche. But what we do see Wedge do in remake is contact Shinra or sorry Avalanche HQ to assist in sort of trying to get him to the Shinra HQ to help out his group of Avalanche, but he specifically contacts them to get that help. One of the things that I was kind of reminded of is that, okay, well, if he has that sort of connection to Avalanche HQ, it would be very interesting to see like who he has a good relationship with. And if he's related to somebody who is working with Avalanche, like this WRO member that would be like either Biggs' sister or Wedge's sister, that would be an incredible in at that point. I see that you
Definitely.
guys are already kind of talking here, so I'm going to try and read some
Okay,
of this.
but and before, so while you read some questions and um get back to some of these questions, and one I saw this is really interesting, and it's have you looked at the story for Dirge Online mode that was released only in Japan, because that is like this huge
I
story.
love it.
But real quick, so I'm going to describe here what I'm doing. This build that I'm working with here. It's one of the wackiest like strategies in the game, and it is the self-destruct strategy. So
Ooh.
enemy skill has, there's only 4 enemy skills that you can learn in remake, which is fine because you're in Midgar. You should feel so lucky to even learn one. I've heard a lot of complaints. There's only 4 enemy skills. Well, it's Midgar, so relax. And and so self destruct does a tremendous amount of damage to both yourself and the person that, or the enemies that you are attacking, and it also causes instant death, and so it's supposed to be a last resort, but in combination with 2 materia and a very high magic attack stat, you can not only survive it but sort of break it in certain situations. And what we need it for is specifically we need enemy skill needs to be attached to HP absorb, because all of the enemy skills that do damage will absorb it at a pretty high rate, 40% when the materia is maxed. But it also causes instant death, and also the order at which self-destruct does damage to you. The order is it does damage to you, then you recover HP, but first you die.
Oh.
So you need 2 things. You need 100% warding from instant death, which is what the combination of subversion and warding does. It's also like makes you immune to tonberries. So this is food for thought on that. But you also need reprieve. which is which is available on three of Cloud's weapons: Iron Blade, Nail Bat, and Twin Stinger. When all the weapons are maxed and you have all the manuscripts, Twin Stinger, even though it's the ultimate weapon, so to speak, or it's the last weapon you get, is
Right.
probably the worst weapon of Cloud's, because it has mediocre stats. And you could say, well, what about Nail Bat? Nail Bat is the unsung hero of Cloud's lineup. Its incredible luck boost and critical hit rate boost makes it straight up broken um, if you've got two luck plus materials that are fully maxed out. It averages, over the course of a minute, about the same damage as the Buster Sword. Not quite as much as Hard Edge as the Buster Sword, but with the benefit of also having the reprieve skill. So the Nail Bat, I've done a full hard run mode run with the Nail Bat, and I've got a ton of just beautiful screenshots of him of Cloud ridiculously going through ultra serious cutscenes with this nail covered bat, and it is a very fun way to experience the game. I recommend it. But Iron Blade actually has the best overall stats of any weapon with reprieve, and so we're gonna mess around with this strat, and I'm gonna show it to you.
I'm excited.
A little
That's
bit,
awesome.
Yeah. Okay, so now
Let
we're
me.
heading. Yeah.
I personally use the nail bat most of the time that I was playing the game. As soon as I got, I was like, I'm a sucker for weapons that are like that, just like the look
like
of it,
umbrella
like not even
and
looking
mop.
at stats. Yeah, I'm just like, okay, this is what we're playing with, and if it shows up in a model, then that's it. Let me see here. So you mentioned that somebody was mentioning the Dirge Online multiplayer, and I'm gonna let you know right now that I think my favorite compilation lore is Dirge of Cerberus, even though it's nobody else's favorite.
I mean, lore wise, it's real heavy. I will
It's
admit.
heavy,
I think
complicated, and yeah,
I think there are two. It's got two major detractors. One, the gameplay was fucking garbage, and it just was. It was
yeah,
their first shooter. They could do better. Two, gacked.
right. Definitely helps boost the lore boost
I'm gonna let
on
you
that
answer
one.
this, and I'm sorry for that I keep Kanyeing you here, but real quick, I did want to point out, the "See the World Through Her High Eyes" poster is a nod to a advertising campaign for a Sony camera, by the way, and you see this camera, this exact camera, in Seventh Heaven and Jesse's dad's room, and a bunch of other random places.
Yeah, as soon as you pointed that out to me, because I was so on about that poster for like a second, and as soon as you mentioned that, I was like, okay, well that definitely kind of checks off the lore. This is an interesting scene in general. This definitely was a big tip off as far as like, you can get a sense that Aerith is already kind of in touch enough to know like when they're arriving, these whispers, and also the way that she communicates to them mostly, and she actually communicates to the ghouls a little bit of the same way. We were talking about this when we were going through that section, is that specifically like Aerith has her hands together in her like usual praying like fashion when she quotes one of the ghouls in that section, and she also prays a couple times during this sequence after this. And I know that we have like sort of a couple of things to say about like just how the whispers operate, that you brought up. I will quickly just go through the chat really quick. I love the DOC multiplayer. I think that there's a ton of evidence in there. One of the biggest problems with looking at with Dirge's timeline as far as like taking into account the multiplayer, taking into account like the interviews based on Dirge of Cerberus, and just the regular mode of the story of DOC. The timeline of Deep Ground is highlighted in the multiplayer. For those who don't know, the online multiplayer was a Japanese only online multiplayer with its own story that sort of tells the story of how all of the Sviets, who are like the primary, like the strongest sort of experiments of Deep Ground, overthrow their overseers, which is they're known as the restrictors, and the restrictors have an unrivaled amount of control over most of the Sviets due to like their technological like hold over them, over the Sviets. So Vice, I think Vice is the only one who seems to have the least amount of they like he's so strong that they also had to take into account like they didn't want him to get so out of control and kill them even with these protocols set in place that he will die if one of the restrictors dies, because they put like a capsule inside of him that will like poison him if he kills a restrictor. So on top of like this control, Weiss also has like that on top of that. It's crazy. Like most of the story is, and also you get to see a lot of backstory for the Sviets, and you also get to see characters that only show up in the multiplayer. So Argento is one of the top members of the Sviets, or more of like an overseer of like the developing Sviets, which your character is in the online multiplayer. I love that character, and she also just never shows up in the main story, so we don't actually know what happens to that character after the multiplayer. It'd be interesting to see some development on her. But just in general, the multiplayer shows them overthrowing the restrictors, and then what happens after that, even though you'd think it's just like a beginning, middle, and end story, it's like, okay, the multiplayer happens, and then Deep Ground starts up, and that's where DOC starts. That's really, unfortunately, not the case. Is that there's a whole slew of things that happen during the time between the multiplayer and the main story of Dirge of Cerberus that makes it super complicated. And honestly, if there was any more information as far as like a timeline of that is concerned, just a timeline of Deep Ground in general would be like super helpful. But there's a lot of room for interpretation.
Sure.
But yeah. So for that question, yes, I've watched the multiplayer cutscenes several times. I'm endlessly fascinated with Dirge of Cerberus, just because of how ridiculous it is, but also how it could possibly fit into like the rest of the compilation, and mainly because a lot of that hasn't been figured out or disregarded. So let me see what else is going on here. I definitely think that Botanical, you mentioned like what effect Jesse's death might have on Biggs, and yeah, Mementos is definitely something like that I would assume those gloves and the bandana are for, which sucks. It's going to be really interesting to see like what happens to his character. There's the praying, by the way.
Yeah. And that seems very, very deliberate.
Yeah. And Cloud even mentions it too. So it's like they're drawing attention to it on purpose. Anytime Cloud ever, or any character goes, hey, like Cloud or Tifa, like that's in my opinion, the developer saying, hey, there's something going on here, because even the character thinks that's weird.
Sure. So, it's almost tropey too, because there is this, I don't want to say it's not tropey. It is a narrative style difference between Japan and the West in general, where there's like scripted acknowledgement, and so a lot of people have complained because I think this is one of the first games that has exposed them to this thing that a lot of us have heard in like every anime ever and every
Right.
and it's the grunting.
Yeah.
Those grunts are actually scripted usually, and this game does a good job of localization where it takes a lot of the this isn't the original language feel out of it, but
Mm.
it didn't write out the grunting, and I'm in favor of that to some extent because I do want to feel connected to the story that the developers at least intended to tell a little bit. I mean, we've recently uncovered some translational difference that like really makes theory crafting hard, but
Yeah,
beyond
most
that,
of them do.
yeah,
Like, I mean, as as a better example of like a translation thing is that a lot of the lines in Crisis Core, as far as like what Genesis says, yeah, the localization, like for the most part, like there's a lot of just across the board, like as good as of a job that you could do as far as translating this.
yeah,
But when you're starting a theory craft, what really like you're looking for is a bridge piece.
right,
And when you're theory crafting on a game like that has multiple versions, like every line counts, and those lines can become really valuable when they're set in a different light or shed a different light on. Like that's how this whole discussion of Sephiroth at the edge of creation, like the way that he refers to himself, like came up. If we didn't
yeah.
have that understanding of how he's depicted in the Japanese release, then we would just not have any like hard clue as to like what we're seeing there. It's not like answered, but
Well,
it
okay,
definitely gives
so
us a direction
So let me
to
say
go into.
this. Let me say this about the edge of creation scene. I know we're in chapter 12, but the singularity, time compression, all things matter, blah blah blah. But the I will say that when I first saw the ending, um, and Sephiroth and Cloud have that exchange, I was like, what
Yeah.
is his deal? He seems so different. Like, Tyler Hoechlin gets a ton of hate because he's not George Newbern. And I love George Newbern. Don't get me wrong; he's a great voice actor. He's a great Superman. But I've always kind of felt like he's like 40 and he sounds 40, and like he started to sound aged in Crisis Core. Like it was like that sounds like a 50-year-old guy talking, especially like when he had to act nice, which was really out of the foreboding character. Um, and I think Hoagland 1 sounds the appropriate age. And 2 nailed a lot of nuance. Like,
Well, I
um,
would agree. Is
yeah,
that what you're sort of distinguishing is that this voice actor has sort of depicted both like this sort of Sephiroth that we're more familiar with in
yeah,
terms of like maybe being like Genova, or and we know that like through like the black coat figured
yeah,
people that like that's a different Sephiroth or a hallucination or like the variations of Sephiroth. But like you
yeah,
said, in the Edge of Creation, you definitely get a sense that this is not the same
yeah,
guy that you've been talking to for most
yeah,
of the game.
yeah. And it's like, is he good? What the fuck is going on? And and then it got a lot of at least theory crafters to like look at, well, what's happening, and then before even Ultimania came out and was translated, uh, people were noticing that Sephiroth referred to himself differently in that scene, and it was only in that scene he referred to himself with the watashi pronoun um, constantly throughout the game prior to that scene. And so, this was a deliberate choice. It wasn't that now in the remake universe, this is how he refers to himself. They made a choice to deliberately change his tone for the Edge of Creation. And so I think the acting was so good that it got most of us looking in that direction.
I
And so I
personally
yeah.
like the Kingdom Hearts voice actor for
Um,
Sephiroth.
are you trying to get like her, or what's happening? You know who that is, right?
I actually have no idea.
So that is Lance Bass of
Who is that?
In Sync.
Oh, no way. Really?
Yeah.
I just like it because of the way that I like the inflection of the attacks, and also most of those lines are ingrained into my head just because of
Do
how
you
hard that fight was for me as a
okay,
child. So
audience poll. Do you believe him? Do you believe that he didn't know that Lance Bass was in Sync?
you keep talking to me, and you're gonna know that I don't know a lot of things. So the fact that you even mentioned that this guy was Superman, I was like, "There's no way,
No, he
like I
did.
would have known
Okay,
that."
well, also technically Tyler Hoechlin was also Superman, but he was, and people are like he was the worst Superman. He wasn't the worst Superman. He was Superman in the worst depiction of Superman, and that's not his fault. But
Yeah,
no,
you
I
got to
actually,
separate the artist from the art sometimes.
so I actually thought, to be totally honest, I thought Lance Bass did a great job, too. And it's just I thought maybe you knew, and it was a very divisive thing. And
That's so funny that it is divisive.
well,
Uh,
I think what it was at the time too. There's, Sephiroth is very sacred to everybody. You do not mess with Sephiroth.
if you
That's
want to
one thing.
bring Kingdom Hearts lore into this conversation, we can do that too because there's a summoning circle for his appearance in that game too. Um,
That's
maybe I'd need to
interesting.
look
Yeah.
at that again. I gotta
Okay.
look at that again.
Okay. So this is interesting, right?
Mm,
Okay. So one, we just saw that Wedge survived the fall.
right.
Um, what's up with that? What's different? What caused that to be different? Like what was the catalyst of that being needed, and why didn't the Whispers react? Like, so the Whispers don't show up to try and like they don't break his little
Yeah,
grappling
his hook
gun.
shot. Yeah.
They don't break that. They don't break it. They don't like accelerate his fall. They don't do anything. But they are starting to show up right now. So what is happening on the pillar that they need to respond to? Right.
Well, it
Um,
definitely seems like the plate falling is their main objective.
sure.
We do know that uh, Jesse is a target of whispers, and same with Wedge. Is that there's something going on specifically with those mechanics of like the story that they're trying to reinforce.
Right.
I always thought it was very interesting that like Jessie had the grenade in her hand, and then the whispers are like behind her. It's like we're gonna mess you up, but like right now, whatever you're trying to do to this copter, it's like you're supposed to like get injured. You're supposed to be here. So like even if you are physically able to defend yourself in this moment, they're gonna somehow you know screw her up in some way. And Kate Sith was brought up in the last stream, and I do think
Um,
that like
excuse me.
it's very
Excuse me.
possible.
Excuse me.
No,
Excuse
we're
me.
not getting into the language discrepancies of that
It's
for
not
sure.
pronounced Kate Sith. It's
Kate Shi,
pronounced Ketchi,
Cat
and
Shi.
we're gonna have to get used to it. Apparently.
No, there's no use to anything for me unless they say it in the game.
The life is your life is meaningless if we're gonna have to change to Ketchi. I'm not a
I
fan of
think
it either. Yeah, I'm not a fan of it either. I'm with you on this.
pretty is
I was
awful.
full bore on Aerith. I was okay with that, but this is the line.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking about the difference between like one like heiress and then like just a small change. But with that, it's just like, oh god. I did like Dirge 2, by the way. I literally don't have a problem with that game, and I enjoyed it when I played it. And I have actually grown to really like it a lot more just from doing all this research.
Okay, so
So
so this is a completely legal thing that I'm talking about, but let's say you have a legitimate copy of the game, and then you want
sure,
to load it in the using emulator software with a completely
sure.
legitimate core for a PS2
So far,
emulator.
so good.
Um, I will say that the emulated experience does feel really good if you've got it set appropriately.
Maybe go into a widescreen mode, uh, if that's physically possible.
Okay, I just want to show this off real quick.
Hmm.
So self-destruct.
Yikes! All right, go for it.
Oh, I barely missed it. Okay.
That's amazing, though.
I know.
It very explosive.
Yeah, it's it does a lot. And here's the thing, if if um I can't really show it here because of and if we have time at the end of the stream, I will actually I'll do it on Leviathan. I'll do it a Leviathan solo run with Cloud.
Oh, that sounds awesome.
You can build your limit gauge up completely, even if it's a level 2 limit gauge, even if you've just used it, because of the amount of damage that you do. It's the total overall damage that you both do and do to yourself that builds your limit gauge, plus a unit of time depending on like your status and if you have go to Damarung and stuff like that. So in with Leviathan, you can, if you inflict Fury and then use Ascension, which is Clim Hazard in the Japanese version, which it should be in the American version. I really don't think that. I think it's dumb that it's not. You can use your limit break. It will stagger him. You can, and if you do self-destruct in the right spot, it will hit all three portions of him: his tail, his fin, his dorsal fin, and his head.
And it just knocks him out of the park.
It only caps. There's a damage cap, so it does 9,990 damage to him. But because it like registers it 3 times for the purpose of the limit break, you rebuild your limit break, so you can do 2 back-to-back.
Oh,
ascensions.
That's awesome.
Yeah. Okay, let's see.
See, that's why I love this game is that and just to like rant for a little bit, like one of the things that I am super into with the way that this game is set up is that the replayability of this game.
The combat system's very good.
Yeah, the combat system has like so much room to grow outside of just this one part, and when you take into account like different members of your party and what they could like. The one thing obviously that comes to mind is like air combat would be a really great thing to like elaborate on, but just thinking about like having gained the knowledge of how this system works from playing the first part, I really hope that they don't like have to reteach us everything with the second game. I really hope that like throughout the series they start like, because if you're playing the original Final Fantasy VII, they don't just all of a sudden like randomly during like disc 2 be like, oh, by the way, this is how we play the game again, we're gonna throw you through a tutorial again. They should really trust that their audience will not only know the combat system, at least the basics of it, and start to advance like the difficulty, not the difficulty in terms of like how to play it, but just like expand on mechanics. So like one thing that I was thinking about is that it would be really great, because we're going to start, if we get Vincent, it's like we're going to get gunners, we're going to get like more ranged abilities and all this other stuff. And even in the ghoul fight, you can see like how they're messing around with like how like Aerith can't like shoot through certain like obstacles that are being dropped into the place. So they're already messing around with like variations of like who to use when and all this other stuff. But it'd be really cool to give like Cloud like a launcher ability for enemies, like a group of enemies, right? Just launch them all in the air, and then like switching to like Vincent or like whoever else is involved at the party at that point, and giving them like interesting air combat, which is one of the things that I was talking about with Vincent in the last stream, is that like it seems like what would be a really great thing to include mechanically with Vincent is the ability to be like an assist / mobile character, and ranged at the same time. Like I don't like, it would be like, and you can have variations because of his transformations and his limit breaks and all that other stuff. See, and that would actually play into the assist thing, is that you want to use Vincent in a fight to be an assist in the fight, build that limit gauge, and then once that limit is full, then he can become like an active like member of like when you stagger like an enemy or something like that. Pop the limit, have him come in with his chainsaw or whatever, or be
Right.
chaos or whatever, and show up. That's super interesting to me. As far as like, again, we're talking about elaborating on mechanics that we're only just now being introduced to.
Yeah. Yeah. And
But just the limitless potential of that combat system.
One of the things I really like the most about the whole like the hard mode thing is, so like this
Right.
game was really designed to be played twice in many ways. So first of all, they do drop enough hints that some weird stuff's gonna happen at the end. And I know that Maximilian dude, who we should really credit for bringing like the, you know, like a real fan into the discussion, that a lot of, you know, like streamers and critics were like, the fuck's going on, you know? But he was like, I'm a real fan. But one of his criticisms is, it's like a dump truck they drop at the end, you know? And like, from the context of your first playthrough, of course it is, you know, because you're not expecting that. But like, once you've seen that, like, they drop so many hits. They drop so many little things like, hey, something's happening. Something's happening. And it's all this build up to that. But you don't really understand that until hard mode. And
right.
And so you know,
well, that's always a difficulty with like games like this, where you sort of have like, you have a ceiling, right, for potential of a combat system.
Right.
And depending on how difficult the game is, because the game isn't pushing itself to like the limit, it's not challenging the player to like look for those things. Right. So like when I first started playing this game, I was like, man, like none of the enemies like attacks are very telegraphed. Like, this is really annoying. It feels like I'm getting hit by things that I should have control over. But all of that starts to sort of lessen once you're really, you know, challenged. And then like basic battles everything becomes more exciting. This is one of the reasons, like, not to bring it up like randomly, but like this is one of the reasons why like one of my favorite games of all time is Super Smash Brothers Melee. I played that game for like 12 years.
Sure,
and just what you become comfortable with a game like that is that you get so much control once you have the mechanics down. It's hard to just initially start controlling your character and feel like everything's in sync. But once you have played a game long enough and the game allows you to express yourself in the, you know, mobility or attacks or whatever through the character that you're playing, that's something that becomes apparent to me in this game. It's like, okay, like I'm not just playing Cloud. Like, I'm playing all of these characters, and each of them fit perfectly for the role that, you know, whatever it is that I've designed them to be, like whether that's a healer, ranged, or like tank or whatever. So again, that's what's exciting to me just from a gameplay experience for this game, is because we're going to get so many more characters, and just having the option of expressing, you know, or highlighting like an assist or whatever, is just going to be super fun. I'm excited to play as Yuffie, and I hardly used her in the original.
You know, one thing I will say about
and Kate Sith,
I think Kate Sith is going to be OP, and it's gonna be awesome.
It would be interesting to see a character that is,
you know, in the OG, the you know, the magic users, and there really weren't like, I mean, the stat differences were marginal, but the ranking of stats went that for magic in particular, that by the way, I've switched to a no healing run, just in case you haven't noticed. I showed off that mechanic. It's fine. So at this point, I am just I'm going to be attempting to just get through the plate fall without healing between fights. None of my abilities heal. It's just all downhill. So if it becomes, you know, like a narrative block, then I will like heal between fights, but I will not be equipping healing materia of any kind. So here we are to Biggs. So let's talk about this.
Very ominous, by the way. Just like them just sitting over him. It's like, geez.
It's almost like they're protecting him. Like, don't you can. It's as if like the. I think the takeaway is supposed to be that they're always there, but because of weird events now, that they're there to
Right.
protect this. Um, that kind of could be the takeaway. It is weird that they didn't get involved with Wedge. Um, you know, that's just weird. Um,
Good to hear. Could have used
It
the
is
I
very strange. Like, and again, like, and we've been talking about Wedge a bit just over like the last couple days.
It's
Um,
pretty bad up there.
his character like importance seems to be the one thing that is like, I mean, a lot of people like point to Jesse, a lot of people point to Biggs, but for me personally, it's Wedge that seems to have the more interesting context for like what we're more likely to see in like future installments, is because of his relationship with like other Avalanche groups,
right.
and all this other stuff. And just how he ends up in Deep Ground is another thing that really, and I've expressed this numerous times, like
Yeah.
in different streams, but that really bothers me. And I actually went back to look at it, and we're going to get to it
Yeah,
in this.
we might get to it tonight. We'll see how pacing works.
Yeah. But there's the scene where he's trying to get away from the plate falling. He is being kept in place,
Yeah.
like right on top of where we find him in Deep Ground, which bothers the heck out of me, because it's like, okay, so why is that being stressed, like
Right.
as far as like his placement? Because that seems pretty deliberate, and we've been talking about placement a little bit just outside of the stream, but like where like Aerith creates the portal, and before we go to the singularity, you brought up a really good point, that like Aerith and the party are actually right over the church when that happens, which is really interesting.
Yeah.
But
I want to stop here just because this is a detail, right? So, what just occurred between Cloud and Biggs here is Biggs mentions the orphanage, which for a lot of people when they first played through this game, because they don't spend a ton of time, or they maybe didn't do all side quests. They're just doing it. Like, this is the first connection they hear to him in the orphanage.
Right.
Especially if you're experiencing this game through something like a stream or YouTube videos. But the amount of connection that Biggs has to the orphanage is made abundantly clear, and like to the point where it's weird that Cloud doesn't like react. How often his name is mentioned. There's two kids at the table outside that are constantly talking about how much they like Biggs, and there's one where they're talking, and I've been meaning to tell you about the Sleepezi. There's one where the kids are talking about the books
no way, really?
the books that Biggs likes to read them, and it doesn't specify, it doesn't give you the clarity you're hoping for, but it's book related, and Biggs is reading to these kids actively still, and he also mentions that Jesse comes with him all the time. The kids mention Jesse by name at that table. It's the only place that Jesse is mentioned in Sector 5 at all.
It'd be such a great scene to include. I have a lot to say about what you just said.
Yeah, I know.
It would be.
I know, and but I got to get to the end of this thought so I can press start. So we know that he's got a massive tie, and then if you do the Miss Folia quest, she does say that I learned everything from the previous house mother, my predecessor, Biggs. And Cloud just doesn't even respond, because that's how Cloud is. And so we do know that he's a fan of kids. You know, we know that that orphanage is really important to him, possibly because he's an orphan. But right here in this exchange, um, Big says, "Hey, um, look after the kids," and then Cloud acts dismissively, basically saying, "You're going to make it through this." And then Big says the following. So I'm going to play this.
No. But you have so much in common.
But you have so much in common. Now, this is actually something that the developers bring up about him. That Big sees that Cloud is childlike because he is. Developmentally, right. He's only 16. And it's visible to other people. And so I thought this was a really cool little dialogue detail. So I'm going to press X and resume the scene.
That is a very interesting point, just because, and there's maybe like an essay to be written about like just how characters, like especially like soldiers, especially like first class soldiers or people who think that they are like Cloud. One of the things that I brought up before is that like a lot of the main characters in this game are like motherless or fatherless, or there's like a lot of those issues in terms of like their development. Genesis is also an orphan, which is odd, because there's a whole like different thing. But I did want to bring up something when you talk about orphanages, is that most orphanages in Final Fantasy VII have an odd depiction throughout the compilation, just because for the most part we know that Shinra does have some level of involvement with most of them, that we've seen depicted. I'm not saying every single one, but most of the ones of note, we see that they're either using these places to develop either soldiers, or some of them, and in Crisis Core we see a variation of both. So we see Sisane, who's a Turk, actually start in an orphanage, and she becomes a Turk, whereas like other kids either are kind of put into like soldier or something like that. So all of these, it's just like if you start going down the rabbit hole of how involved Shinra is with like most areas in Final Fantasy VII, just overall, like it seems like for the most part, like, I mean, you can even bring up like the kids are all right, in like the term of like what happens to the main character's mother, like where she ends up, and like this is what happens to most employees. Is, for those who don't know, and I'm pretty sure that this is the case, is that the main character in the kids are all right, his mother gets put in Nibelheim, to oversee the Black Cloak figures, essentially. And if you look at like the history of Benora in Crisis Core, it has a very similar background and use, that similar to Nibelheim. So like the more that you look into each area, and then you look at Com, which is the area that we're gonna most likely end up in at the start of remake, right, part 2, is that Com is also has a huge history of like Shinra Tai. We know that there's a scientist specifically there that are we about to hit Jesse, or is that coming up? I don't want to skip over anything.
No, we're not there yet. Tifa still needs to join, and we still need to cut back to Aerith, and there's a lot of good stuff in the Aerith exchange.
That's true. Anyway, I was just highlighting, just like if you look at like most of the history of these areas, there's just a huge amount of Shinra Tai. There's just in Com, like there was an accidental bombing, and people involved in that incident. One of them being the leader of the Turks' daughter, and I think Verdot, who's the leader at that time, also gets brought into the same facility that Elf is brought into. but he's told by Hojo, or a scientist, that his daughter is dead. But she actually ends up becoming the sort of figure leader of Avalanche. Not the leader, but like she's the one everybody looks to that's calling the shots primarily. But like in truth, there's like Rufus, there's Vegito that are kind of pulling the strings on that. But it's just interesting how deep like all of these areas have to just either experimenting on like kids or just the development of these areas. It gets crazy. So, and all of that history I do expect to show up at some point. So like in Calm, like having a history of the bombing would be a really interesting nod and would give us like a lot of information as far as like how involved Before Crisis is going to be. Like if they mention the bombing, then we know for sure that Before Crisis happened, right? For the most part, or at least a part of it did.
They are beholden to nothing given how vague they've been, but it seems really clear that they're trying their best to validate the previous experiences that
to
people
some
have
degree.
had, to a degree that they can be functional with. I mean, there are obvious like minor changes that nobody was expecting. Like nobody expected Sang to just like backhand Aerith, you know?
Right. Especially given like what, and again, there's like that sort of mental like exchange that you have to have with yourself. And this is something that I always have to check myself on: is that what is a change for like just the sake of a change, and then what is like a theory, avenue change. And one of them is like Sephiroth shows up a lot. It's because the developers are just aware that we know who Sephiroth is, and there's no mystery behind.
Yeah, the mystery's gone, so they have got to create a new mystery.
A new mystery, right?
Yeah, and is it a different experience? Obviously. They've made characteristic changes that they were nervous about. Nojima was very nervous about how Cloud was depicted, because he, quote unquote, is more awkward and sometimes cringy, and he was afraid that that fans wouldn't like that, because he really does care a lot about what fans like, sometimes too much. So those things were clear from the gate. There's going to be that kind of change.
You know what just happened there? That's really strange. Is that you'd think that the Whispers would have been involved in that if they wanted to keep Aerith alive.
Well, I think Tifa is a Whisper, and that's been confirmed several times.
Okay, good. All right.
I can't stay here.
That's right. I missed that, that chapter.
Yeah.
Is that a mobile phone game? The Lost Episode?
That's
awful.
It's one of the novels that hasn't been translated.
Great.
It's attached to a $500 art book.
One of the things that, pretty much. One of the things I would really like to do is go through Remake and just highlight how many times each compilation is like game or movie is referenced. And I know that would be not an easy task, but for the most part, the only one that hasn't been really discussed even Before Crisis kind of shows up just because of the way that Avalanche's the HQ Avalanche members
and
are dressed.
Yeah.
It's like the same design, just updated for like Avalanche soldiers. So it's like
no Ravens yet though. Just as a note, for some reason this is one of my my favorite little segments of the game. And I also do want to mention a couple of other things about this. Just FYI, the sense of danger and hurry that this chapter, and both here and on the plate when you after you fight Reno and Rude, is completely fabricated. If you can let that counter go down to 0 and nothing will happen. The game doesn't end, and then there is nothing that happens if you like just stand still and listen to all the dialogue with Aerith, even though you're supposed to be saving Marlene. Real quick, guys, I have a question for you. Okay, so and just if you can, if you already know the answer because you've looked it up specifically, just don't answer.
Yeah.
How, and especially people that have experience with children, have children, how old would just your assumption be about Marlene's age? How old do you think Marlene is? And I'll let people answer that, and then you can talk if you need, if you want to, if you haven't put on any parts of these scenes.
I thought that was a flaming body for a second.
I was hoping
I was like, I missed that.
I was like, oh man. We can set
like 5.
Yeah.
I'm not sure what's gonna happen next.
There is a gut check that I feel like Wedge just like, and this is something that is notable, is that for the most part, Wedge Wedge does seem to have like this gut feeling of a reckoning, and Aerith sort of confirms that like feeling of dread that's going through him. But obviously, since she's a Cetra, she's more in tune with like what's going on than Wedge is. But I wouldn't, because we know that like Bugenhagen has like a level of connection to the planet and stuff like that. I wouldn't be surprised if Wedge is probably like the closer of the group of like just human beings in general that could be in touch. I'm not saying that he is, but for him to get like a bad feeling is not odd, but it's a little strange just because the dialogue is so specific there.
Yeah. Yeah, and it is definitely one of those you know, yeah, the plate's gonna fall, there's nothing you can do because I can see the future Aerith moments too. Like, it's really clear, like, yeah, I can see the future, so adjust your expectations, you know, like, right. It's kind of that sort of thing. And so real quick to answer the question, okay, 2 questions, because that's a really good point. It's a super good point. Yeah, I thought like 6 or 7. You know, just like based on like, I don't even remember why I hadn't like thought of this in years. Because of the maturity level, and even because of like the physical size, she is 4. And she's like pretty with it for a 4-year-old here, and especially considering like how like on point her humor is in Advent Children when she's 6. Like, I thought she was about like 10 in Advent Children, right? Because of like, you know, making the Barrett impression, like, and just, which is a really charming little scene, by the way. Oh, you haven't watched Complete yet? Did you make it all the way through?
Haven't. No,
I'm sorry, I spoiled that. Okay.
Oh, don't worry about it. I'm at this point, spoilers are probably just
it's your
enlightening. Yeah, it is my fault at this point.
So, yeah, good job, Skittle. And then, but Tiger Chick makes a great point. Like, yeah, hey, like Barrett's just like father of the unit over here. But I guess it's the point. Like, you know, he's trying to save the entire sector. But he should have had like a, maybe leave, you know, like, hey, let's get Marlene out of the bar before I start fighting Shinra on the roof, sort of thing. Because she's just like left there. But hey, you know, it's tough for an adoptive father. And I really do like their relationship. I think it's one of the most heartwarming things. And they really amped up how cute those two are together. But I really do like this. So, like, we were talking about how in the Ultimania for Wedge, it's specifically mentioned that he has these is useful for his connections to different parties,
right?
Like, almost like he's kind of a
he's like an ambassador. Yeah, exactly.
Right. And I think this is one of the other ways. Like, the main one is that he's his tie to HQ. Like, we're starting to understand that. Although we do know Jessie has ties to HQ because she got those codes and talks about a friend she has at HQ in chapter 1. But here we have like, you know, this really neat scene where he kind of like gets an opportunity to humanize, you know, these faceless infantrymen that we like so readily just like dice through, you know, with this dialogue.
I think actually one of the things that they highlight in the Ultimania is that one of the reasons why he is so good at talking to these two groups or several groups is because of how he is as a person. It's not that it's like, oh man, I went to school with this guy, so like I got an in. It's like it's not like a favor owed. It's because people genuinely like Wedge's character, and I think it's pretty apparent to just like from like this game that his kindness and his like innocence and his like good outlook uh, is what is appealing about him for most people. So, and one of the things that you just brought up triggered a thought process in my mind is that you mentioned Jesse having a connection to HQ as well. One of the things we do know of Jesse, Biggs, and Wedge is that they all grew up together.
Right. Because of
And
one of the slides.
So this further makes me think that if they did grow up together, then all three of them would know either Biggs or Wedge's sister.
Right.
I think that I know that I'm like harping on that particular aspect, but any sort of like level of connection that they would have to her, and if she is involved in Avalanche in any way, like it would make sense that Jesse has an in because it's like I know somebody on the inside or I'm familiar or friends with these people. It's also interesting because like just when Barrett becomes a part of Avalanche, that would be a very interesting thing to know because we know inherently that he's not an original member. Barrett becomes a member of Avalanche after all the stuff that happens to him. He's not originally like, known for that. Whereas Biggs and Wedge, I would have to clarify, and Jesse, it seems like for the most part they start with that through Barrett rather than already having been involved. But I'm not sure about Biggs and I'm not sure about Wedge, but maybe they were.
So one of my favorite things to do on this stream, and much to the chagrin of probably everybody except me, is I like to show clones of the same person in frame. And if you see the person directly to Aerith's right or our left, you will see that same person in the group behind us.
I see him.
Yeah, it's the same person. So,
well, there's not a lot of like hair
clones.
salons down there or clothes shops, so they all have to they all have to go to the same place, right? At some point.
Okay.
That's my lore answer.
That's your headcanon?
That's right.
So, okay, and then
just seems like bad driving at that point, doesn't it?
Yeah, and it's like Aerith seems to be the most aggressively able to see the whispers. Like at least we know she can see the whispers first, more than anybody, and she's been able to see them for an indeterminate amount of time. And we know that from the Ultimania interview where they ask like, why did Aerith seem scared in the beginning of the game? And Nomura's like, maybe she was running from the whispers, right? So I find it interesting here that like, where are the whispers with this helicopter shenanigan,
right.
And so again, it's just like it's furthering this idea that maybe this isn't capital D Destiny, maybe it's capital J Destiny.
I see what you did there.
Yeah. And we can get into that a little later. I do want to because this is like a dumb asset, like super Easter eggy run that I do, and it's might just be fascinating to me. I wanted to point out this. So this light right here. So this is used throughout in various forms, and this is almost an exact like texture for like just like they 3D scanned a type of kerosene heater. Like, and if you compare it to the a model of kerosene heater, and I'll probably like make a list of these.
I would love to see that
one time. This looks exactly like a kerosene heater that's like commonly bought in like areas where kerosene heaters are often used. Like, it's a super cheap, terrible smelling form of heater. But they like reuse this and then just add different like attachments to the top, like throughout remake, like in different parts. Like it's in the Shinra building. It's all sorts of stuff. So I just thought that's a fun detail.
Is that Bleed the Planet Dry poster? I'm imagining that that's like everywhere.
Oh yeah, it is everywhere. And it is obviously the most present here, but it's like on the upper plate too. In chapter 4.
Yeah, I definitely. Yeah, it's sorry. I was just like fixated on it a little bit, but
Finally.
it's funny how they like. Yeah, I would love to see like a list of reused assets or just like any sort of consistent like we were talking about before. It's just like models and stuff like that. The only one of those that I've mentioned is in the to you at least is in the VR cutscene where it seems like they pretty much only had like maybe 4 or 5 different Cetra models that they wanted to use
Right.
in the outside, and it's like it's kind of weird to say because like that's a fully like rendered CGI cutscene that they would only use those. But I digress. I wanted to read this and thank you, Seventh Heaven. Yeah, dude. Honestly, like looking at all of these, looking at anything like remake or any sort of game that has like this sort of in-depth sort of level to it where you kind of are able to like theory craft. Like I love stuff like that. Like I just love engaging stories like this, and I'm on the same page. Like when a story like this kind of gets you fired up to like explore it and you start loving it, like I feel like that's a huge motivator for me just outside of like talking about theories and stuff like that for my own like creative juices, so to speak. So I'm glad that works the same for you, and I appreciate the comment for sure. We need more people thinking in depthly about like art and stuff like that in general because it just perpetuates more good stuff to put out there in the world.
Daddy! You'll be fine.
What the hell was that?
Something interesting about this chapter, or actually about Sector 7 in general, is it's the only reason that it's
We can get through this.
the only reason that there are any occurrences of Beagle Stamp in this chapter is because of the scene where Stamp's champs come out of the celebration after the reactor bombing in chapter 3 near the end. This is a mysteriously like bereft of Stamp area, especially Stamp graffiti, which I find interesting since it's the headquarters of
the
Barrett's
Midgar Avalanche.
Barrett's Avalanche. And if you get Barrett's resolution scene, he talks about some of the other Avalanche members that Cloud never gets to meet, and there's 777 right there. I'm wanting to point that out to you.
Hey. And then a kin.
Yeah.
Odd. Being able to control who you want would be a really nice touch.
Yeah, I hope they like patch that in or something.
When the PC release, I'm sure like you'll get like a bunch of that coming out.
So speaking of the PC release, I'm obviously excited for the possibility of that. But they haven't technically like confirmed that they're gonna do that.
It would be really like honestly, I'm not waiting on like my hands and knees for it. But it would definitely be like a nice. It would also just make it a lot easier to sort of get assets at that point for everybody. I think the biggest problem that we're having now with like gathering assets from the game is just because it's at this particular moment, from my understanding, and I'm like super a novice at like any of that stuff, is because there's not a way to pull the information off of the disc as of right now.
Well,
Who is
not an
that?
easy one.
Right.
There is, obviously. And speaking of, the only thing really of value that anybody has found happens to involve the character that we just saw.
Right.
And that is in the game data. There's a
Please be okay.
there's a younger Sung model, which really would have come in handy in the Elmira flashback, where he's theoretically like 15 or 16, because Aerith is still a child, but instead he's just appearing as this like ageless Lucrezia type.
Yeah, you know what? That kind of frustrates me too, because in Crisis Core he has his hair up still.
Yeah, but it's in a bun.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
And in this, they just decided, we don't want to do that.
Well,
and
they like made the model like
right,
like what
exactly.
happened? Like they couldn't get the hair physics right, and like 410 was approaching. They had already blown the 3.3, which they had they put in a bunch of assets, and I showed this in my last stream, but it's like there's a lot of items that have 3.3 written on them, which was the original release date and the original slated release date for remake. I love this scene between these two. Like the ambiance is just really interesting, and there's one of my favorite shots in the game coming up, and I'll point it out. And a lot of people have pointed out details in here that are it was some of the earliest fun details, and it's the pictures. There's so that picture of pictures on the wall right there is from Advent Children. That is the a shot directly from the rebuilt Seventh Heaven in Edge. And it's just
I was just noticing that myself. I didn't know that was like actually hung up on the wall, though. I just remember looking at like literally the first part of the complete, and that's literally the shot that they use in the opening. So
yeah, and this is a shot of this shows up in the art book as the design shot for Seventh Heaven. So that's a piece of like concept art just put into a patient, or put into words. There's that camera I was talking about.
Right, look at that.
Yeah, and check it out. So these two pictures. First, there's a picture of the OG Seventh Heaven in the back there, and almost everybody noticed that, both the exterior Seventh Heaven and the interior. But these two pictures, you cannot see them well, but somebody did like some.
That looks like Barrett in one of them.
Well, it's Barrett from Advent Children with his white vest on over the fishnet, where he has the cornrows, and 6-year-old Marlene.
Okay, so why would you do that?
And it's just a little nod, but it's one of those annoying little nods, especially considering all the other like contextual future time travel stuff that makes you just like, well, is it significant? And then there's the reunion flower,
right?
And I just love that despite the world literally falling, that you could spend 6 to 7 hours wandering around this bar without proceeding, with literally no impact on your life. I don't recommend it, but that's not to say I haven't done it.
What's that book on the table, by the way?
It's the planetology book.
Okay, good.
No, it's just a generic book.
I hear you. Just as an aside, just because it's just something that came up, is that one of the reasons why Barrett is designed the way that he is in Advent Children is because he was apparently too much of a Mr. T lookalike, or he constantly got that comment for the original design in Final Fantasy VII. So they try to make him look as much unlike him in AC as possible.
And I like both. I hope they have a I hope they have like, DLC outfits.
That'd be great.
They could only unlock after the game though.
Where is she?
This is a
Right now.
this is a great
she's with
dialogue,
Cloud and the others. Daddy too?
and of course, a lot of
There?
people
Yep, he's there
have
too.
derived Marlene as an ancient from this.
Wait, Daddy's not coming home?
I mean, I don't think that she would be
Not yet.
able. I hate to be
That's
like
why
that
I came to
naysayer
find
because
you.
I know that that's like a pretty
I
like
need to ask you
popular
too.
fan
You
theory.
said take care of Marlene.
But for the most part, her
The thing is,
getting
this place is
access
safe.
to information through
I will
Aerith.
take you somewhere
Well,
safe,
I mean, okay. For the most part, we know that at a certain age, you kind of become aware as a Cetra to like the planet in a larger way consciously, just due to the fact of the short story in remake, before remake happens, where Aerith has awakened according to like Hojo. It's like, oh, okay, now you're like fully in tune or picking up on
Just
something.
remember, you still
Um,
have your daddy.
if you wanted to make
Those
that
who
argument
belong
for
together
Marlene, it's like, oh, she's
anywhere.
just not an awakened Cetra, which is why she like,
Shall
you
we
know,
go?
I personally don't subscribe to that theory, but just to feed the fire, I guess you could use
And
something like that.
there's another noted streamer slash YouTube personality that loves to bring that up, and it's just good to know that we both agree that he's supremely wrong about it. I the other one being that Marlene grows up to be Marl, and Marl is Marlene from the future, and
Wait,
that was
I don't
just
even know who
like
that is.
Marl, the landlord of the Stargazer Hotel.
Really? That's
Yeah.
no.
I can't
No.
believe you haven't heard that.
Why would on earth
So nice.
somebody's gonna have to explain that to me?
Well, it's really simple. Like their names are similar, and people are dumb. Like I don't know what else to tell you.
I don't know how that
no,
works.
No. I don't want to say people are dumb.
Just
people
in
like,
jest.
People like to just make connections, and it's a fun. And some people just like throw darts in the wind and catch stuff, every now and then. So
hope you remember
it's
it.
good to know. The
Come on.
we're getting from Sleepezi and in Seventh Heaven, like my favorite, my favorite, one of my favorite like little topics is like, why do we not know
Of course you can.
anything about
Hey,
Cloud's
what's your
parents
favorite flower?
until like but I do like Sleepezi. I'm very encouraged by the fact that we now know the ridiculous name of Cloud's mother, even though it's ridiculous.
Claudia?
Yeah.
Why not? At that point, it's just like a shrug. I saw that and I was like, it's fine. It's just a very unimaginative father. It's like, all right, I know the answer to this one.
So, okay. And we don't know who the dad is at all. We know that like Nibelheim is home of the clouds. Just the composition of this shot, by the way, like the lighting, the backlighting, and I think
it's like the greatest entrance for this character that he could have possibly got.
I think he got an incredible entrance, and then there's a scene coming up too where they walk out together under the light, and I think it's the most beautifully composed shot in all of remake, and that's saying a lot. And the deal here is good. I you know what, I'm pretty stoked that
okay?
that he didn't hit her, because I think Song is a redeemable character. He gets more and more interesting as the compilation gets better, and I'm glad they didn't ruin him out the gate.
I think that would have been a really like horrible move. That wouldn't have been a good place to start introducing like that the Song that we learned to know just through like other compilation mentions of him, and also just his role with Aerith and all this other stuff, which is something that I got into with Otto last night too. But just for tidbit information and I'm sure everybody's already aware of this, but
By the way,
for the
that was my favorite shot right there. That one we just passed.
the zoom in and then the transition.
Just them walking out together, holding hands, like underneath the, like there's just something so Aerith about that moment, like the calm and collectedness, and it was also one of those things that kind of showed her level of peace with destiny. You know, like the way things were going to happen. You know, it was just an interesting aside.
What the hell?
Nice catch.
So go on.
Is there any specific reason why like Rude is like
Suck it up, 'cause I'm
not
leaving.
cooperating here?
He does seem to have like the most kind of hang-ups in this one. It's weird, like, but
Because he's about to kill. Like the ironic part about this is that they're about to drop a plate.
yeah,
So like the potential of these characters escaping is already like 0 to none. So it just seems very odd to me that like Rude would not. It's almost like he wants to be like one step removed from what's happening to them.
okay, well, all right, so
Which is ironic, just because the Turks are usually like the down and dirty characters.
they are, but they all have like these moral issues, and there's
humanity.
there is one specific detail that you're forgetting, is they've probably been aware of all of these people, at least except for Cloud, maybe, for a while now. And remember who Rude has a crush on, and who just showed up.
Right.
Yeah.
Good point.
Possibly, that could be it.
Hint. might have something to do with it.
Maybe.
Maybe.
There's been so many questions. Oh, okay. So maybe his name is Cloud S. Oh,
Yes,
yeah.
sir.
We were thinking Claudio might be his name, but you were thinking Cloud Senior. Yeah, that could be it. That'd be weird, but you know, there is also the possibility that that's not actually her name, and that's just some weird Genova memory thing, and that
It's such a that entire section of like how Cloud operates is very strange, and
It's
I
not
know
well
I've talked
defined,
endlessly
yeah.
about this already. But just Genova cell inclusion to any character, just like for, I know I've brought up Dirge of Cerberus and how complicated it gets, but like if you just look at any other game and any time like
We can
S
switch
cells
numbers.
or like G cells or any sort of like Genova infused like soldiers and all that other stuff, you start entering into like this really complex, like, and this is just me kind of maybe venting a little bit, but a lot of the time that I spend looking into videos and stuff like that is mainly clarification and trying to back up like just solid traces of information, like in regard to like how things work.
Right.
And we were talking about this yesterday, is that like geostigma and like all of these different versions of how like the language of like how that's referenced, or maybe it's not, or maybe it's like a separate thing. Like, is hatred geostigma? That's a reference in like On the Way
Right.
to a Smile. Or is it like something else? Is it just a naturally occurring like element of Final Fantasy VII, that if you have hatred in your heart, you just don't join the live stream? Like a lot of my time is spent just trying to be like, okay, are these things the same or are they different?
Yeah.
Oh, there's a blurb of Wedge. I think that's the blurb I actually read.
Group alongside Biggs and Jesse. Yeah.
And where do you think you're going?
Anyway, but yeah, it's just when we start talking about like Genova cells and like especially like in Remake, they seem to be highlighting a little bit more of a centerpiece importance to like what Cloud will end up being in Remake, as far as like this bigger role that's happening here, like unlimited potential,
Yeah.
and
the
all this
Chadley
other stuff
scene
is
being
mentioned.
Very, very, yeah, strange and essential.
So when you start looking at that, and just how that's like, okay, so it's like, okay, so now the story is highlighting some level of importance to Cloud on a different level. So like, as a theory crafter, it's like, why is that, right? So is there any evidence to support this? And that starts getting complicated when you look at the compilation, because even in, like, let's, for instance, I know Last Order is widely regarded as just something that is just not involved, and I honestly don't mention it because I kind of feel the same way about it. But you have depictions of Cloud in several instances in that story where it's like, why is he so special all of a sudden? And I mean, what I'm specifically mentioning here is that in the Nibelheim incident, Cloud somehow becomes, I guess, empowered in some level to like be able to overthrow Sephiroth, even though he's wounded, or takes him off guard and all this other stuff.
Yeah,
He's able to,
his eyes glow like,
yeah, his eyes glow with like the color of like green, which is Mako. But it's just like, okay, why is he so like, why are they amping the same scene up in this way? The other level of importance that he's given in the compilation is that he's, I guess, you know, he has S cells in him, which is Sephiroth cells, which, I mean, from in the most likely scenario is the reason why he's important in this game. If Sephiroth does, and this is just me spitballing here, but from what I understand of how we're all looking at Sephiroth in this game, is that there's something that he's doing that is different to cause this series of events in some way, or Genova or whatever.
right.
But because of his connection to Sephiroth, that's most likely the reason. And I mean, it's just, yeah, it's for some reason that's maybe what's giving him his importance.
Right.
So that's my own opinion. There's no definitive truth to that. And it's one of the reasons why I don't talk about it. I haven't talked about Cloud in length for the reason that, like, that's just open to interpretation for the most part. And also just what they decide to do in the game. So
one thing, so, and I just, real quick, so I have heard the theory that in Last Order, what it was supposed to intend is that Genova's blood is on Sephiroth's blade because he cuts off her head.
that's weird.
And that when he stabs Cloud with it, it's into like immediate boost from Genova going into Cloud. And
that's interesting.
It's interesting, but it's just like, it's only something that you see in Last Order, and they kind of but at the same time, it felt like the whole point of Last Order was to like weaken Cloud in that exchange, even though he had the glowing light thing. Like,
right.
In the end, Sephiroth still jumps off instead of being thrown off.
And for those who are unfamiliar, I think there's two separate depictions of Sephiroth actually, like in Before Crisis and in Last Order. Sephiroth willingly jumps into the Nibelheim reactor rather than being tossed off like in the original. He is tossed off in Crisis Core, which is the most recent variation of that scene. I don't remember where Last Order falls into that, but I'm pretty sure that came after or before Crisis Core.
Yeah, so it goes. It was developed around the same time as Dirge of Cerberus, and at the time, Crisis Core had not been greenlit.
Right.
So developmentally, it was meant to, just kind of. They're like, well, this will be something, and it can be on its own, and we're not gonna have to worry about continuity because, this is just a fun story to tell, and then built this kind of life. I love this, just like poor random avalancher. Like, what a way to go! Like, just.
That's the best way to go. I mean, thinking about it now, if Sephiroth is sort of distancing himself or somehow like removed himself from like this concept of destiny, you would imagine that maybe anything connected to Sephiroth would also get the same treatment, which ironically is exactly what happens. Is the two people we know for a fact have S cells in them are all freed from the concept of destiny. So Zack lives and Cloud are now free to do whatever they want. So maybe that's an interesting way to look at it, is more of the fact, yeah, see, whispers gathering up.
Yeah, and we don't really, like, Soldier's confusing.
Soldier in general is just a confusing concept.
We really thought for sure that we understood, you know, like, not we thought for sure, but like we kind of just made guesses, like, okay, well, most soldiers are S cell soldiers or S type soldiers. Like, you know, Kunsao is probably an S type soldier. That's why he's not degrading, you know. But if you look at like Dirge of Cerberus, you like compare all the like the timing of everything, especially with like lore-rich Dirge of Cerberus. We actually don't know if all soldiers have Genova cells in them anymore. Like a lot of them could just be Mako infused. It's not well fleshed out. And
yeah, the history behind Soldier in general like starts. So for those who are unfamiliar, there's a sequence in Dirge of Cerberus that is a training mode sequence, where if you play it, there are soldiers in there, but for the most part, that's pre a lot of events, and one of them being most likely like pre like Genova, I think, as far as like that project is concerned, or her discovery.
Before her discovery, even like
right
before
so,
the age of Sephiroth, and so like yeah, and then we find out that Angeal was born a year or so before Sephiroth, so Sephiroth can't be the first soldier anymore for sure. Let alone like just the age stuff just doesn't it really doesn't jive super well.
Yeah, it gets very complicated.
Partially too because the Ultimania timelines often contradict one each other, and this latest one, the latest Ultimania, like changes ages of things. Like it changed Rufus just to like make sure for sure that we don't think, you know, so that he's, you know, essentially like 5 to 2 years older than Sephiroth, you know, and that it makes Ifalna's as like a super inappropriate candidate for Rufus's mother. Okay, so let's look at this scene. Let's get through it.
So for the most part, no. As far as we're aware, the only first class soldiers that were a thing were Angeal, Genesis, and Sephiroth.
Right.
And then Zack. And this is like, you can regard this as more or less an opinion, but one of the reasons, in my opinion, that Zack even becomes a first class soldier is because most of the first class soldiers defect. And Lazard is kind of who's in charge of that department at the time.
Well, and their defection.
Right, exactly. So the fact that they defected, and like Zack is the only person who's even remotely qualified to be even like a second class at least, right? Is that they're like, okay, well, now we need a first class, and since we've lost all of our main players, like de facto, Zack, you're now a first class soldier. So it's like, at this point, the only other soldiers that we really know of as of remake is Roach, or however you say his name. But at this particular moment, there are no first class soldiers that we're aware of. And most of that program, like the whole concept of like these soldiers, like first class and all this other stuff, they were developed. The concept of soldier was developed as a way of leveling the playing, or outplaying Wu Tai, essentially. Right. Is something that is mentioned in the original Ultimania, is that soldiers were the push over the edge for Shinra to win. So like Sephiroth's involvement at that point, and just that whole lineage of like characters at that point. And then in Crisis Core, we see the end of the Wu Tai War being brought about through Zack's actions. So for the most part, that has remained relatively true. Is that the soldiers brought about the end of Wutai. So before then, maybe depending on the timing of the Wutai War, there might have been certain soldiers, but there wasn't like Sephiroth or something like that.
Right.
And also something that I just came across is that Hojo, and this is just a weird side like fun fact, because I know that like at some point like we're gonna sit down and really talk about like Jenova and Sephiroth and like what that's all about, is that, and I didn't realize this, Hojo and Lucrezia's child, he has to get clearance from Gast to make Sephiroth, which is super strange. Is that he's like, oh, I used this, my Lucrezia's child, and he says I want Lucrezia's child to be a part of the Jenova project, and I guess either Gast clears it or he allows it, because for the most part, like Gast doesn't leave after Sephiroth's creation necessarily. Right. So Gast is not as good of a person, I think, as we have seen him depicted. I think like his intention is not bad. Like he's trying to develop like these alternate versions of Cetra so that, you know,
but
for the purpose of good.
So what makes you specifically, what is ever said about his character?
The only thing that's stated about his character is that he learns something about the Jenova project, and that Jenova is not a Cetra, and that is what makes him leave. Is that after learning about that, he abandons like his post as the head of Shinra, the science department of Shinra. That's the only information that leads us to, and also just the fact that he's Aerith's father. He helps Afalna leave the Shinra HQ at some point. Those are the only definite facts that make him anywhere like regarded in the way of good or evil.
Right.
But like Vincent, there's again like one of the reasons why I brought that up to begin with is because like even Vincent mentions in the OG Final Fantasy VII that he feels guilty that he didn't stop Gast or Hojo from experimenting on, or from allowing this all to happen, and that's mainly referencing Sephiroth's birth. So from what we know, it's like Gast was kind of already in the middle of doing all these like sort of weird experiments, maybe not as like pushed to the edge like Hojo is, to like, you know, develop these crazy concepts of monsters or whatever. But he's definitely not as good as we may think that he is.
Sure, yeah.
I'm honestly getting to the point because of I think that we're going to be seeing a lot of interesting developments with Gast, and just in general, like I'm really excited to see like what they do with that character.
Yeah, I hope we see him explained. I hope we see Lucrezia explained more, and Grimoire. I'm just so uncomfortable with Hojo and Lucrezia's relationship. It's just,
I think they even, now that you say that, like the way that they even set up Hojo in Remake, and that the way that they deal with that one scene where it's like, hey, like we should have these two, like we, you know that scene. Yeah. I'm sure just based off of that the context of that story could very easily just be changed just for the sake of you know how uncomfortable that whole situation is. For those who don't know, like in Dirge of Cerberus, like it becomes pretty aware that like there's a very odd relationship that Hojo has with Lucrezia, and it's not maybe the most viable way to tell that story anymore. Yeah. So just because it's a different time, and it's also just, I don't know, there's a lot of ways that they could do that, but I feel like if
It's just
they
gross too.
do go with the Sephiroth redemption arc, they would need to elaborate on his upbringing a lot more. I mean, and I think one of the things that I've stated maybe in the past, maybe not as like specifically, is that I really don't think that Sephiroth is going to be a good guy. But I do believe that there's a lot of room to humanize his character, in certain ways. And when I say humanize, I mean like give him more of a like of a backstory development, and just exactly, just make him out to be a more tragic character, which Crisis Core tries to do a little bit.
Yeah, but it ends up making the transition between the before and after just seem downright kind of unrealistic. And
right.
So but I think the best bet. I don't want to retcon Crisis Core. I really do like Crisis Core. Of the games, it's definitely up there. But I would like to see past Sephiroth dedicated, a little bit more cruel, a little bit more consistent with like a child soldier that has no purpose or meaning, or I would like to see his characterization seem a little bit colder, like the way that it was in OG. Like Tifa even said, like
that the impression that she gets off of him is just like but like even before anything happens to him is not good. I mean, and here's the thing is that if you do show Sephiroth as a child, that would be prime pickings for Angeal and Genesis involvement as well.
Yeah.
You know how I feel about all of that. Was Hojo influenced by Genova and not a crazy nutbag? Is that well, if you mention that to Baby Seal, there is dialogue that he brings up about the kids are all right. That Sung has the perception of Hojo that sort of elaborates on what you're saying there, 7-7. Right. And I'll let him answer that, but I'll answer your other question, which is that why would she be with Hojo? Is because she's a torn character for some reason. To sort of I hate to like paint it like that, but that's kind of how I feel about it. She's a scientist and she's dedicated to that like life and pushing the boundaries, and Hojo obviously is he's way overboard, but she is working with Hojo on his experiments with gas and all this other stuff at that particular time in the timeline. And she chooses to involve herself with Hojo. And if you look at DOC, just like the whole events that lead up to that is strange. Oh no.
Okay, let's watch this and then decide the rest.
I also think that tiger chick, by the way.
It's Hope from Final Fantasy 13.
So, you're the guy who gets to hear my last words. Lucky me.
Like hell they're your last.
It's okay, Cloud. It's okay. They were my bombs. They were all my victims. I had it coming.
This whole blaming of like herself is tragic. I think that's
such a good addition.
Probably her
to
best
her
character quality. Yeah.
Yeah.
Just try to hang on.
See, this is what is definitely something that they could totally capitalize with each character. Like Aerith being maybe blaming herself in future installments for causing like this timeline rift or whatever is going on. Like if things start to go awry, like this example that we're seeing with Avalanche and like the way that the characters are morally conflicted with what they're doing, like and just with the OG is like this conflict with Avalanche and Shinra, all plays into like the bigger scheme of the story,
right,
in terms of like, and what Remake has done very, very well is bring up the morality of the decisions that they're making. And if you just take that same concept then as like Midgar and the Avalanche and Shinra relationship from Remake and blowing that into the rest of the story as far as like the bigger concept, is that it's really setting up this like moral gray areas, like who are the good guys, who are the bad guys.
I want to point out Cloud's reaction here. It's really interesting. It's like it's a discomfort with feeling. Like he feels legitimate loss and pain, and he's even more sad that Tifa's feeling the pain, which feeds into, you know, your kind of earlier feeling that a lot of his personality is developed based on Tifa's perception of him.
That's true.
The
yeah.
initial Genova mimicry.
There could be like a whole video series, honestly, that somebody could just make on just like the cells, and how they influence each character and stuff like that. But that's a later date for that. Sometime later.
And Jesse's death feels a lot more deathy.
Yeah, they really amped this up.
And there's no whispers here, where there were whispers like around Biggs after he died, after you walk away, which I think is notable. So I mean, there's that. But on the Chadley being modeled after young Sephiroth thing, I have heard the theory that Edge of Creation Sephiroth is grown-up Chadley.
I've not heard that.
Well, now you have, and that's really all there is to it.
And I honestly want to go back in time. I'm going to create a separate timeline where that just doesn't happen.
Well, where you didn't even hear it, where I didn't even just tell you right now that people have thought of that, because now it's in your head and you're like, great, now it's a thing I'm factoring in when I'm theory crafting.
I do think that there is a possibility, just because of Hojo's involvement with Sephiroth's like birth, that like there's like a lot of room that you could just argue that like, yeah, he could be very easily modeled after like a younger Sephiroth. That doesn't mean that he is, but it's like maybe the look and depiction of him.
Or Vice. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Vice. Oh, that would be terrible. That's not a bad, by the way. You could make a better argument for that.
You would be so stoked, bro.
I would be so stoked. Don't even get me started.
Don't even lie. You'd be like, oh, well.
I would be
Chadley's
like
just
all
my
over
nickname.
that.
It's my nickname. My true birth name is Vice.
Chadley.
Vice Chadley Hojo
the third.
Yeah. We both said the third. Jinx on the third.
Right. There is actually like more precedent for that. I'm not gonna actually make an argument for this, but like it's more likely that Vice is could be Chadley, just because Vice actually has the same ability that Shulk has, or Shulk. I can't remember which one.
No, it's Shulk. Shulk is the one from is the
Chronicles.
Probably. Yeah, and Super Smash Brothers.
You're right. Which is the only thing I know.
Which Nojima wrote.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. He writes the story for Smash Brothers.
Oh, that's right. You mentioned that to me.
Isn't that goofy?
It's too much for me to even think about.
Well, you don't have a choice, bro.
Yeah, I know. I can't shut the brain off even if I wanted to. But as I was mentioning, is that S&D is the ability to access the equivalent of the internet in Final Fantasy VII. Vice has that ability, and Shulk has that ability in Dirge of Cerberus. Don't get me started on why those two characters do have it, because that's an entirely different discussion. But the point of me bringing this up is that Chadley is hooked up to something that could be very easily tied into the same system that S&D is referred to. But the likelihood of S&D being involved in remake is already like super low, just because it's one of those elements from Dirge of Cerberus that's controversial, and that's not even a joke. Controversial is an understatement. Most of Dirge of Cerberus is not regarded very highly in terms of like its additions. So, but for me, it's just fun to think about. Yeah, Xenoblade Chronicles.
Yeah.
And I would love to make that video. I think one of the things that I wanted to bring up to you,
BC,
because you and I were talking about whether or not Genesis's cells are used in deep ground experiments, or is it G cells, is that it specifies with Rosa's birth that it's Genesis's, which complicates matters.
Oh, there you go.
And because Rosa is born very shortly after Genesis' birth, I think. But
still, you could argue that Genesis's cells are
just G cells.
Yeah. And that they manifest differently. Like all Genova cells manifest differently depending on the subject.
So, and in that argument, right? So like this is how things are classified, right? So you have Genova cells, which are just known as Genova cells. When they're implanted into somebody, like S cells, they're given their own category of use. So with Genova cells, with Sephiroth cells, they're now S cells. So G cells are Gillian cells specifically referring to. So regardless of, like, unless they're directly used in, I guess, G cells, Gillian cells, then it just becomes this entire like other thing. So if they're using Genesis's cells, you could say technically yes, they would be called G cells, but they would be Genesis cells rather than Gillian cells.
Right.
It's just, again, talking about cells in Final Fantasy VII can really get into like this entirely different subject of like deep lore, and which people wonder like why I'm so on about Deep Ground is because half of Deep Ground's like creation, even though you don't see it, has a lot to do with like Genesis. Genesis is one of the main reasons why Deep Ground becomes Deep Ground, whereas Deep Ground before, like as an example, so Deep Ground before the events of, this game, for instance, is actually a facility that is dedicated to healing wounded soldiers and like staff members. Like that's its initial creation's purpose.
That's another great shot, by the way. Is Reno standing on his sword, and then just one of the fun little curse words that they add to make up for the lack of blood in the localization is "It's nothing personal, bitch."
Sorry, losers.
This whole scene is actually pretty fantastic.
Mm-hmm.
Just like this is like cinema, like at its finest in terms of like the storytelling of this game, like with Root coming out of the helicopter and stuff like that. Deep Ground, like that's one of the, like after these theory videos are done, I think more specific. I'm gonna start getting into more specifics. It's really hard to get into like people think that like hour-long videos are like, man, like you can't like simplify this more. This is simplifying the lore of Final Fantasy VII, because you could make like an entire series just based off of Dirge of Cerberus alone. But the Deep Ground thing is that it starts out as a medical facility. It's only after Genesis is born that scientists decide, or I guess Shinra decides, that the direction of Deep Ground is going to change. So when people look at or say to me that they don't think that Genesis is going to be involved in remake, and there's a lot of legality that people start bringing up, is that Deep Ground in the depiction of Remake seems to be painting a very just the fact that it's involved and just the fact that G cells are mentioned is that Deep Ground's direction doesn't seem to have changed at all in Remake. If anything, they're highlighting it to bring it up for some level of importance, right? So,
Yeah.
and also just looking at failed experiments and all that other stuff. The one thing that I didn't mention in any of my videos is that the unknown entities that seem to be very similar to Genesis show up in the drum where Genova is, which to me also signifies that Hojo, and Hojo is aware of Deep Ground, by the way. We don't know how involved he was with Deep Ground, but he's aware of it, which is mainly how the events of Dirge of Cerberus even start, is because he's aware of it and he uses Vice and all this other stuff.
Yeah.
But the fact that those creatures are in the drum with Genova and that Hojo is gathering data based off of your encounters with these unknown entities is really making it clear to me, at least, is that he's gathering data for maybe something that might involve Deep Ground in the future or just creatures from Deep Ground. The list can just go on and on from there. So yeah, and I'm betting that he is wrong. I'm of the mind that Genesis is very yeah, he's going to be involved in some capacity. And I think that if you mention Deep Ground, you're pretty much setting up for that, like just inherently, because again, Deep Ground starts with Genesis. So like you don't get the Deep Ground that we see in Remake unless Genesis has some placement, or Angeal, but it's mainly Genesis that's mentioned as far as like his involvement. There is some history that you could go into with Gillian that does paint a very interesting picture as to like where she is and how she ends up in Benora. So for those who are unfamiliar, is that Gillian is the mother, and when I say mother, I use quotes. She is the biological mother of Angeal. She is the non-biological mother of Genesis in terms of his production of involvement with Genova cells, or her cells specifically. The story goes is that Gillian was a scientist for Shinra before she was in Benora. Benora itself is a Shinra-built town, and the only reason Gillian is there is because Shinra needs to watch her, because the first instinct I guess she has after having Angeal is to try and escape Shinra. So very similar to Gaston of Falna, Gillian tries to escape with Angeal. She fails, and they put her in Benora to watch over her. So the reason, and it's actually really interesting because one of the reasons Gillian is even shown to us and why Genesis is even in Benora to begin with in Crisis Core is because Hollander, who is the scientist that starts the G project, figures that Gillian might know a way to stop Genesis's degradation, but she kills herself before they can ever find out whether or not she can help. One of the reasons why she does do that is that she's just so ridden with guilt, which, by the way, is an immediate parallel. All of those events parallel Lucrezia in almost to a T, and reflections of Falna and all of that. So,
I can't. I won't.
Let's do this.
Yeah, I see why Genesis is a massively polarizing character. Yeah, and I guarantee you, Sony, that the only reason that is because of two things. People really don't like the inclusion of him in the Nibelheim incident. That's like one of the biggest pet peeves that people have. I'm sure that the DOC cutscene with him speaking like a vampire doesn't help either. That was so dumb. That was such a terrible creative decision. And then the other thing is that people think that he's a bother because he just constantly quotes Loveless. So we're talking about pretty specific things. First of all, I don't think that they will be highlighting Genesis in the Nibelheim incident to the degree that he was in Crisis Core. I think that they're very aware of that decision and how upset people were about it. Secondly, I think that if you were to take Genesis's character and just tweak his representation character-wise and highlight different levels of importance of his lore importance,
Sure.
You could do a much better job of selling that character. What I don't like is people having this knee-jerk reaction to, oh, Genesis. It's like that's not my immediate reaction, just because I never really felt so strongly about him. But I do think that regardless of whether you like the character or not, there is a lot of interesting lore stuff.
Just so you know, I'm gonna beat this battle, and it is a little hardish because it's of no healing. So just to do it, I am going to take my headphones off.
Oh,
so just do not feel left out. I'm just a focus.
You're
thing.
focusing. Yeah. I hear you. Go for it. Yeah, I mean, honestly, unlikely is the first thought that comes to mind. Seventh Heaven they shouldn't really, because that is where people are definitely like, I would kind of draw the line there too, because it's unnecessary. The story works fine without his involvement in that particular part. And the only real reason that he's involved is just to strengthen the connection between Genesis and his degrading and this whole SL plot line. It's unnecessary. It's not needed. You can do it in 10 different other places. He's also just trying to show Sephiroth what kind of monster he is, but yeah, and that's again like an interesting way to paint that character. Tiger Chick is just like, and it's the same thing that people want with Sephiroth, is that they want to develop that side of Sephiroth more. Like, you could easily do the same thing with Genesis.
Prepping for a bombing run. How copy?
Say what? I see you're doing whatever the hell you want.
Yeah, so so you mentioned before, Tiger Chick, that there's there's a lot of confusion that the lore kind of paints around that specific subject of like how people are integrated into the live stream. From my understanding of it is that On the Way to a Smile paints Sephiroth's spread of geostigma, and that's what causes this apprehension of the live stream to allow people into the live stream, which is how Aerith finds these, souls On the Way to a Smile, and how she has to cure them is because of geostigma.
Take the lead.
So, and that's the other thing, is that it's very unclear as to like what exactly allows certain people into it, as far as like Angeal and Zack. We know that from Kadaj, and Kadaj is like pretty much just like a Sephiroth incarnate based off of his own will. He's allowed access through Aerith, it seems, or through purification with like Yazoo and Laz, because of the healing rain that happens. And you know what's odd about the death of Angeal is that it does start to rain when Angeal does die. So you could say that maybe there's some connection to that, but there's no evidence to support that there's anything happening in that scene other than Angeal just dying. It also happens when Zack dies. So and we know for sure that Aerith, in interviews, that like that rain is specifying, not that it's caused by Aerith, but her presence is supposed to be felt through that.
It's on you.
Could you do the same thing with Genesis if Gact has a final say?
Taking over.
What do you mean by that, Otto? By the way, what's going on?
Don't overdo it.
Glad you can make it.
Fight through it.
I think that you could also, like, and not to like ride the Genesis train too hard. Could you though? Could you make Genesis the same as Sephiroth in Crisis Core? I think you could make him more compelling. There's an argument that you could definitely make that you could make him more compelling than he was in Crisis Core. 100%. You could even just shut Genesis's mouth and people would probably take to him a lot better. Like I think that the adjustment would be a very, very like small one that you'd need to make in order to make him likable. You just have that dude stand there and you could pretty much tell his story. I'm only half kidding on that, by the way. But I do think that you could do something with Genesis's character to make him more interesting and more appealing to the audience. Yeah, it would be interesting to see, like, as far as what we know from right now, we don't know how Roach was made. But if he's made like a typical soldier is, it's most likely just a small injection of Genova cells and a buttload of Mako energy. Degradation through that process is more of a mental thing that happens. Like your mind starts to go, which is something that is actually mentioned in Remake by Aerith's mom. So is that the life that you're trading in for the power that you're trying to accumulate, essentially. Right. Yeah, and they do. It's just the difference between degradation of like, for instance, Genesis and a normal soldier is actually painted in a very different light, because, and this is where language definitely gets confusing in terms of like lore stuff, is that Genesis is using an ability that he has to create these copies, and that's a direct connection to Genova specifically, that he's able to do that. But the difference between Genesis and Genova is that when Genova splits up, she's relatively fine. She can use reunion to gather herself back up, yada, yada, yada. But with Genesis, what happens is his body starts to literally like become unstable. And he's already an unstable body to begin with, because they highlight that in Crisis Core, is that when he gets cut in the VR segment of that game, right, they die from degradation, but it's not the same type of degradation, because the one that specifically is highlighted in Genesis is his biological like structure based off of his more deep connection to Genova, and his sort of like failure to incorporate those cells is what causes him to fall apart. Whereas, like, for instance, on the other side of that, Angeal is also able to use this copy ability, but he doesn't degrade. His physical self is relatively fine. It only becomes a problem when he merges with like the four different beasts. But that's all Genova ability. That is not the same as like a regular soldier degradation. Regular soldier degradation is mainly caused, from what I remember, is just through Mako poisoning and just going through the process of even becoming a soldier. Like, some people don't even make it to that point, you know. They just, you know, fall out because like Mako poisoning just messes them up so bad. So at some point, soldiers do just have a lesser life expectancy because of like just all the stuff that they go through to become a soldier. But for the most part, that's not the same thing as Genesis. President Shinra says, yeah.
Need a breather.
Also, do you think that they... I will get to you, Otto, by the way. I will read that. I just saw this one. I think involving Kunsel in some way would be awesome. It's... Yeah, having Kunsel involved in any way would be awesome. And maybe, like, playing that up whenever, like, Zack decides to show up would be an awesome thing. Or however they're planning on incorporating him, like, having Kunsel involved would just be an amazing thing. There's a lot of characters that I would love to see like make a return, like Kunsel. So the fact that he's even mentioned in this game is just like, it's awesome.
Take it from here.
Yeah, for the most part, like Otto, like I totally agree. Is that yes, he is a plot device. I would definitely say that it's a challenge to make him more interesting, but I think that just given the approach that they used him in to begin with and how unlikable, like widely Genesis is regarded as a very unlikable character. I think that there's like 7 other decisions that are small tweaks to keep him as a relatively, as you described, like a plot device while still making that character semi-interesting. Good job, by the way. Crank that out.
No healing.
No healing run. That's how it is.
Who knows?
I just had to.
Oh, hi, Otto.
Yeah, Otto's here. And yeah, Seventh Heaven. Like as I stated before, like one of the big things about being a theory in like Otto and Baby Seal can be secondary on this as far as like backing me up on the statement is that wow, those are a lot of whispers.
It's pretty whispery.
The main job that like you have to do while making these theories is like you really have to clarify, because you run into things like, oh man, like degradation is like used in this way and this way. It's like, yeah, there's a lot of like specificities of those mentions where you have to be like, are those the same thing? Are they different? Yeah, it just comes up a lot. One of them, as a fun example, is the concept of rebirth comes up in
Kingdom Hearts.
In Dirge of Cerberus, actually. The concept of rebirth is mentioned, and the language discrepancy in that is an issue. And I had to spend, I think, at least like 6 or 7 hours, like just trying to make sense of that one thing. But once you do, it makes it make a lot more like easier to see things. Whether it proves to be beneficial or not in the end is, you know, debatable. But has any other soldier have? From what we know, no.
I mean,
G cell degradation.
G soldiers do have a different garb
You can't do this!
in CC, but those are clones.
Yeah, and that's all. If you wanted to get into like clothing and stuff like that, that's
yeah.
There's also a different soldier symbol for clones that's depicted on their garb.
Right.
And it doesn't show up anywhere else other than in the Genesis clones or copies. That's an interesting tidbit for those.
It makes us think that it's a creation of him. Like it, you know, it probably has to do with the fourth act of Loveless somehow.
I am gonna really quickly step away for a minute,
Okay.
but I'll be right back.
Well, this is a good scene to watch too, and
I know, right?
So it's pretty easy to do from a like gameplay standpoint. It's pretty easy to do no damage runs of either Runo and or Reed individually, but together they are a different beast altogether, and they're not real fun with no healing, but it is, as you can see, doable. As I mentioned, and I accidentally walked a little too far, I was going to let that timer go down because it is meaningless. As are physics, apparently, because it doesn't make any sense that you would be able to use these zip lines on a collapsing plate. But, fantasy's in the title, so I don't know what we're expecting. This is one of those explosions that it's a pre-rendered scene, so as a result, Midgar looks a little different than in other scenes, or than in the rendered scenes. And I'm gonna wait for Sleepezi to come back, simply because this is a real weird thing. The whispers around Wedge saving his cats, and then where Wedge ends up is it's super fascinating, especially to Sleepezi. I find it fascinating too, but given his DOC fetish, nobody is gonna find it as interesting as him. The cats are all named after various Avalanche members, and there he is, Ketchi, apparently, or as the known world calls him, Kate Sith. And this the Midgar model doesn't quite line up with the even the asset they use for the playground set, like the weird face slide thing. That's different in the pre-rendered scenes, and a lot of people use the differences to justify their own pet alternate timeline theory, and in my humble opinion, that's very silly. But God, Reeve is such a furry. I know, right? But we don't kink shame on this chat, Otto. The which cat survives? Yeah, Reggie. But yeah, the cats are representing Biggs, Wedge, and Barrett.
By the way, Reeve has 10 of those things apparently. Those dolls.
I think, and we can't prove that kink shaming isn't Otto's kink, and so by
that's not disclosed in any Ultimania yet.
Yeah,
so.
preventing them from doing so would be kink shaming. So it's is it our destiny to defy destiny? It's an interesting question.
God.
So I do always like to take some time looking through different things in the menu, and we're going to do that here in a little bit. But back to the point, the different assets that are modeled, I've said this a couple times, in the cutscenes, are very likely not an indicator of the alternate timeline. just Stamp is, and that's really all that matters. I mean, like Stamp, it's so obvious that that's the plan. Um, you actually have to do work to try not to accept that Zack survives. Either it's Zack from an alternate universe surviving, or Zack survives in an alternate universe. And that's what the whole Stamp thing is about. You don't need to look at Midgar models to like kind of read
Distinguish
that.
whether or not, yeah.
Yeah, and what that means for the continuity is totally up for grabs, and they could change their mind about it, and it could make sense or it could be incoherent. All things are possible through Minerva.
I do want to mention really quick, just because the scene is playing right now, that and I use this mainly in editing rather than like disclosing it specifically, but one of the things that this story does so well is it really paints, and I know that it's a cliche at this point where it's like characters like grip their fist and all this other stuff, but you really have to, like, especially in remake, look at when these moments happen.
Right.
Is that Tifa's about to do, yep, right there. And it's also done with like fist bumping and all this other stuff, but you have to also take into account that Barrett is about to say this, is that he's about to mention hatred and using that as a driving force for their future endeavors against anger in this situation.
Yeah.
How they're using that drive to drive their objective. And I'm gonna just put money down and just say that, like, for the most part, that's not the place where they should be coming from, and they're gonna learn that lesson in harder ways, I imagine, in like the future of remake. But it's also something that's highlighted when in the first encounter with Sephiroth, that Sephiroth actually specifies that he wants Cloud to feel that hatred and use that as a motivator for him to like continue to like follow in like,
right.
I guess, the objective that Sephiroth is trying to paint.
Now specifically though, that dark side, you know, that Emperor talking to young Anakin speech thing,
right?
To be, just because I think it's important to specify which form of Sephiroth says that. It's illusion Sephiroth, which I think, as mysterious as question mark Sephiroth is, illusion Sephiroth is the second most, because the source is so confusing. Like, right. Is it Sephiroth exerting his will over the Genova cells in Cloud? Is it a recollection mixed with, you know, with, you know, Sephiroth's control? Is it Cloud's own lack of sanity, you know, that is causing, you know, that to happen, and he's getting fed information that's contextually interesting because of Genova? Or is he from the has Cloud lived this cycle too before? Is that why he sees stuff from the future, and he often sees it in, you know, like close to seeing quote unquote illusion Sephiroth? You know, all those are just weird possibilities. I'm more of the line that it is in fact, you know, Sephiroth that is you know, making him see those visions.
See, I think that what this is where like drawing lines in the sand is sort of when you start. I'm not saying that we're wrong for speculating, and that's the whole point of like this kind of discussion is that this is where I definitely start looking at like what the importance of, or the relationship in terms of Cloud and Sephiroth is just inherently at this particular point in remake, is that we have several different ways of making a link to Cloud and Sephiroth. In the original, it's the fact that he's an S cell type soldier,
right?
And in further iterations of the compilation, there are future bonds
Right.
that Sephiroth creates to
Live
to
stream black
Cloud.
and white. Yeah.
Right, exactly. Where is that Sephiroth literally implants his his connection to
Yeah.
reality, or to just in general, to keep himself whole in the life stream, to Cloud's memory of him, which
Right.
is ultimately what creates
And
a piece of that.
and I fully agree. And it feels like Advent Children Cloud is specifically, or Advent Children Sephiroth, whatever that means, is specifically the Cloud that is targeting his illusions, because it's always the illusions that are saying things like, that are saying things like, "I am your everything," and
Right.
just really super aggressively highlights their stamp and the actual Temple of the Ancients right there. And so how does Shinra know what the Temple of the Ancients looks like? Well, we can sort of assume that they know it's there, there's that. But why is it all of a sudden like an interesting set piece for their movie propaganda? Well, we do know that Aerith draws the Temple of the Ancients on the painting, so that I think elevates it as a thing of interest more, to Shinra in trying to propagate that that imagery.
I said, where you going?
Aerith's house. It's in the Sector 5.
Did I lose you,
That's where my
Sleepezi?
No.
This is a little,
Where we
just
hope she is.
I've never heard you not talk for that long.
Tell me she is.
Yikes.
Give me
No,
some.
I just wanted you to get your point out.
No, I
Without
appreciate it. I'm just teasing, and you're awesome. You always have you've done a really good job at
Who am I kidding? I'd probably
like
try to
filling
take
every space with like info, even while I'm doing hard mode fights and stuff. Here comes one of my favorite little things here. So we're talking about the ancients.
They come up in planetology books, meant to be the original stewards of the planet. Could even commune with it, talk to it and stuff.
Which of course triggers a memory.
So badly.
Within my veins flows the blood of ancients.
And of course Ultimania lists this as a recollection, which makes sense.
This is also, I think, one of the only times where we see this white space referred to, other than
Chapter 5
there's
or
yeah.
Chapter 8, yeah.
Yeah, but in that scene, it's mainly playing off of. There's another thing that I want to note here is that what this is specifying, in terms of how the group becomes aware of Sephiroth, because for the most part, in the compilation, they actually make it pretty well known that there's only an awareness of Cloud to Sephiroth at the beginning of the game, and that changes. There's a very key moment that comes up later, with Sephiroth and the party, and it actually is like the moment. It's pretty highlighting of when they become aware is when they're in the drum. Sephiroth is only visible to Cloud, until Tifa actually touches Cloud. And now they use the same shot to show Cloud seeing Sephiroth and Tifa not seeing him, but he's standing right there. But Tifa then touches Cloud, and they go back to that same shot, and now Tifa can see Sephiroth. Right. So as far as when the party is able to start to manifest a vision of him, might be through because of Genova's presence in that scene, because she's right in front of them. That could be one way. The other is that for the most part, it could have been a transfer of sight, similar to how Aerith is able to show Cloud the whispers after making contact with him in in the first part of the game. That's something that I haven't brought up necessarily, because the other thing to note is that Black Cloak figure is mentioned to be that particular Sephiroth at that point. But we also know that that particular character is able to sort of appear in different areas in like these weird ways. Like after Shinra's death, like he's able to like teleport himself outside of the room.
Okay, so
like helipad.
well, yeah, and that is so he's got that illusion, and then the so that's number so it's number 2 is Dreamweaver, and then it's number 49 is the one that's outside, and or I think I have those backwards, but whichever one isn't Dreamweaver ends up being the one that Palmer sees, and at the same time we're having we're having that hallucination in the theater, the VR scene with the ancients, that all of a sudden turns into something, and it's not something that just Cloud sees. Cloud only sees Sephiroth, but Barrett and Tifa see Meteor, and Ultimania makes the assumption that it's because one of the other numbered clone, while one is dealing with Palmer, the other numbered clone is messing with the Cosmos Theater, and so
Right.
yeah.
And the Cosmos Theater is just like this entire like situation, specifically because of the language that's used. But for the most part, there, and me and Baby Seal have gone back and forth on this a little bit, not in terms of like disagreement, but there's just,
it's a weird scene.
Yeah, it's just a weird scene, and the way that the characters react to it and like how the dialogue is doesn't necessarily paint a very hard line with how much of it Tifa and Barrett see. Is it like, do they see all of it? Do they see like all of like the stuff with Sephiroth?
Two quick pieces of trivia. I know you know this already, but for those that don't know, Andrea is Jules's older brother. Just FYI.
Which I didn't even know about, by the way.
And it's only revealed in the Ultimania. And then this is the old guy that you're a dick to in Sector 5 when you won't take the key back to the Moogle kid. And so you're a jerk because you say, hey, walk yourself. Well, he apparently walked his ass all the way over to sector to Wall Market from
like, all right, I guess I will.
Yeah, if there's a honeybee in, I guess I'll go.
Right. Yeah, I think something that Baby Seal mentioned earlier is that what instead the route has become for like describing Cloud's behavior, Seventh Heaven, since you brought it up that he was like more of a jerk in the original, is that they're more highlighting a childishness that is being recognized by most of the party, of like Avalanche and just everybody else, is that that's mainly what they're equating Cloud's behavior as, is like an undeveloped, like kind of childlike dude, rather than like just this blatant like ass, essentially.
Here's a segment that only opens up later. This is the first time this is an open part of the map, and there is just later in chapter 14, if you're looking for completionism, there is a music track right here in chapter 14. Just FYI.
You guys were mentioning that Cloud might need to die in order for Sephiroth to die completely, and I think for the most part, what is inevitably going to come up, depending on how it, like, once we really honestly, if we get just just a smidgen more of information as to like how this Sephiroth operates, I think we'll be able to define exactly what is going on and how he directly needs to be defeated. But from what we've seen Aerith do in several different occasions throughout the compilation is that she does seem to have some level of ability to relieve spirits of connections to Sephiroth. She's able to completely like remove any sort of contact that like Kadaj and like Laz and Yazoo have, not necessarily just because they show up in remake, but from depictions in the compilation. Her healing rain, her touch, like all of that seems to do something to the presence of Sephiroth. And even though in On the Way to a Smile she is afraid of him, I think that there is a likelihood that she could very easily sever some level of tie that Cloud has to him, if that is the case, which we're not 100% sure of right now. But I think, again, like just with all JRPGs go in or just RPGs in general, story-wise go, is that eventually we'll learn exactly how the Sephiroth is operating, what the characters need to do in order to stop him. And ultimately, I mean, depending on...
So I just something I noticed that you just said was the Sephiroth. How the Sephiroth is going to be operating. Fun fact, that's technically the correct grammar for that word. Because Sephiroth is plural. And a more apropos pronunciation of the word is Sephiroth. That's the more commonly chosen one, but that is plural for the Sephira, which are, you know, the emanations of the Jewish tree of life. Just thought I'd throw that out there.
I thought it was a joke. Something's not right with the world today. What does this mean for
All you.
Agar's future?
I'm glad that I finally used some level of pronunciation that you accept.
You are a star, and I only pick on you because I love you.
I know. I feel it. I feel the love coming through the cat she reference. I can't even say that yet.
I hope
Not
do it. I hope they let us have that one. I mean, Aerith, we deserved, but
My ears
Right.
are still ringing from it.
This wasn't
Um, let me see here. Yeah, I
This is Sector 5, right? So
yeah, I mean,
Marlene is.
Where I think she's
one thing that I've been like tossing around in my mind is one of the things that really freaks me out about where we find Aerith at the end of this game is that for the most part, it really feels like Aerith has a lesser connection to the planet by the end of this game. So one thing that's like normal, right, is that in OG, when we see Afalna, is
You
that
did it.
she... I did. I've learned. I have evolved. Don't press X. Anyway, but the point that I'm trying to make here is that Afalna mentions that she's having a harder time now because of how things have progressed on the planet, that it's becoming increasingly harder for her to hear the voice of the planet. Where she then mentions that things have changed. So before it was easier for her to access that information. Now, through the entire storyline of Remake, we know that there's some level of connection that she has to the planet. She is like connected in some way to like the sense of her being able to feel the whispers and all this other stuff. But at the end of the game, she has no idea what's happening. And now I think in the past I've sort of equated that to, okay, she's no longer able to see the future is what that's signifying. And I think that's still true. But I think the reason that she was able to do that to begin with was through her connection to the planet. So the fact that she's not able to see what's happening anymore says a lot more about where Aerith is in regards to like her character for the future. And I would actually go as far as to say I think that the planet has sort of disconnected them itself to Aerith, whether that was done through like the torn apart whispers, which is how the language of the Ultimania specifies like what happens to the whispers is that they're torn apart,
Yeah,
not
that they
necessarily
die.
destroyed, but
And another thing of note on that is that there does seem to be, there's that apprehension before she makes the decision to go into, like she stops Cloud the first time, and it's almost as if she knows that she's making a choice to, that there's almost a sense of betrayal, like I'm betraying some entity that I care about by letting us move forward through this singularity.
right. I definitely think that there's a lot more that could be maybe clarified, and I know that you have your own thoughts about like the whispers, but for like my understanding of that entire thing, yeah, it definitely does seem that there's something that's happened to Aerith, and from my opinion and just how I've painted it in the past, I really think that like because of the decision that Aerith makes, she's kind of, and like you said, apprehensively, she sort of like it takes her till the end of the game to make that decision for herself. But I think she's going against the will of the planet at some point in the game. Is when she decides to fight Destiny with the party. And you know what? I wanted to bring this up because it's something that I noticed is that there is a lot of subtle dialogue that comes up between the like just a bunch of different parties in remake. Barrett actually in his relationship to Wedge specifies that Wedge did something that he would not have told him to do, and that he didn't really like it all that much.
Right.
And that's when he contacts Avalanche HQ. He's like, I didn't give him the order to do that. And there's a lot of this defying of order, defying of the person who's in like the head of something. Yeah. And that's immediately playing into like Aerith and how right. she's being depicted with her relationship to the planet. So as far as I'm concerned, there is some level of like defiance that she's posing here.
Sure, yeah.
And because of that, like you could just endlessly go on about like how that's going to affect so many different elements of like the future of fun fact, actually, there's some crystals sitting up on that shelf. And they're all over the place, I'm sure you know.
Yeah.
But they're specified as crystals. But from like the compilation, they could very easily just be Mako crystals, which are things that form just in caves naturally, it seems like. So
yeah. And another detail, like in I haven't taken everyone who's on here through the tour of some of the bizarre stuff in here, but just in case you guys are treasure hunters or completionists or haven't played the game or don't look at guides or whatever, just FYI, there's a semi-powerful artifact in the room that Barrett was just talking to Marlene in. It's an accessory, a mythical amulet. So she told just FYI. And then also there's that set of books here. She must trust you all a great deal. The 7 books, yeah.
Yes. We're gonna get something about that in later. I hope. Probably the last one. Just some clarification. There's also something that's about to show up here, and this is something that I've spent a considerable amount of time looking at. Is that you're going to notice on this train in this flashback that we're about to have that there's a particular design choice, and you can see this design in the train, in any train sequence that you go into, is that I'm not sure if it's the interior or the exterior of the train have these symbols of that are a reoccurring symbol of Cetra, Cetra garb, Cetra like armor in Minerva, and then in the church more specifically. But you'll see it very briefly in the close-up when the train doors open, and you see it a little bit clearer in the earlier train sequence when Tifa is like walking through the train through the cars, but or maybe that's later.
One other detail. In this scene, this is in the Sector 5 train station, and on the the very right hand side of the billboard setup, there is a picture of Stamp. And if you play this and if you kind of have to like rig this, but you can rig this to play it in ultra wide resolution, which is like just it's double HD. And if you happen to do that, you can see a picture of Stamp on that billboard. That is likely because they just reused
the asset of it.
The asset of it. I would not consider it proof that Stamp was, a Beagle 15 years ago, but we have other proof of that in the, in her and Nefalna's room in chapter 17.
Right.
So
there's the pattern.
The pattern.
You see that mainly in like the church and in Aerith's church. So
that's interesting.
It's just weird, like a lot of architecture choices that Shinra seems to make around like fountains and things like that.
Yeah, you can actually see him here. I just FYI there was. Yeah, I didn't even notice. That was the first time I've actually noticed that you can see it without ultra high resolution, but still, just FYI.
The other thing too is that same pattern of Cetra garb shows, and I know I've talked about this before, but like Amira's like shirt has that same like type of patterning. The other thing too is that her necklace was like a huge thing that I wanted to look at because it was like semi out of focus in several shots. Had to go find a model for her at some point to like see that a little clearer, but it's very like there's a lot of like.
Is it in the art book?
It is, but it's not well shown. I think actually in that art book with her concept art, it's not even the same necklace.
Oh, okay.
So
jerks.
Yeah, I know, right? The one other thing that I would like to note is that there's actually two different dresses for Aerith, the childhood Aerith. One of them is blue, and the other is yellow. And I think the blue one shows up. I can't remember which one shows up in the Ghoul cutscenes when they're showing her off as a kid, but I know that it's either the blue or the yellow, but the other dress is actually depicted in the black and white scene. You just wouldn't know it because it's in black and white. Yeah. But if you look at the concept art of the character, it is a different depiction, and then people have found the model of that character and it's the same. The colors match up as well. So I'm just guaranteeing just through the color of it in here that it's the blue dress rather than the and it's also a different ribbon too, which might actually be a fun fact for other people, is that instead of the pink ribbon, it's actually a yellow ribbon. So,
and we've talked about this, but we've considered the possibility that Elmira's husband was in fact a few days later soldier like in Soldier,
right,
for a variety of reasons.
Just because she
seems to have a really good understanding of what Soldier means and what the sacrifice means. She knows Cloud's eyes immediately mean he's in Soldier, and you could argue that maybe Aerith told him about Zack, but it seemed like, you boys made a trade. And here's where young Sung is supposed to show up. but instead he's timeless, ageless Sung. He's supposed to be like 14 or 16, I think, here.
But they just decided to
We'll
just
make
use
him,
that model.
we'll make him look 30.
Right. Ageless.
Aerith, you know you're not just a girl.
I'm going to step away for
You're
2
a
seconds,
descendant of the
but I'll be
Okay.
right back.
I had no idea what he meant, so I said, "Who are the ancients?"
They were the original stewards of the planet, whose boundless knowledge and wisdom shall guide us to the promised land.
And their Sung is just
Some believe the
being a
promised
company
land's
man.
a myth. Others
You know, that
believe
is a
outlaws.
description. It's sort of a paraphrasing of the
Take the words of the
words
scriptures at
of
face
quote
value,
unquote the
and believe it to be
scriptures.
quite real.
That
Which is
Barrett
why
seems to
she
know.
would
Aerith,
very
you know,
much want Aerith to help.
obviously
I'm not an ancient.
knows. And
But Aerith, even when you're
we
all
find
alone,
out that
don't you hear
there's a
voices whispering
planetology book
secrets?
that everybody's talking about
But all three of us knew.
in
that
chapter
wasn't true.
14 in the
That man
old
knew
folks home.
exactly who Aerith
There's an
was,
old guy looking for
where
the
she'd come from,
planetology book, and
and
then
what she could do.
he's trying to recall the name of the person that wrote it, and he says
They knew where
Google
she
something.
was.
So we get an indication that there is a book that
Doesn't sound like
probably a
it's
lot
her
of this is being
She had to come
read
anyway,
from, that
otherwise
was
it
written
wouldn't
by
work, he
Bugenhagen.
said. That's why, even if they did take her away, I'm sure she's still being treated like a guest.
Well, okay, so
And that they'll send her straight
there
back
is a
home
model
once
in
they
the
get
game
what they need.
data of
Doubt
Sung
it.
with short hair called
You're
Young
not planning
Sung,
anything, are you?
but
Don't
like
make things worse than they already are.
it just didn't show up in the game.
If I
We don't
lost
really know
her
why.
too,
Maybe DLC or
I
something.
don't know if I could
Don't make things worse than they already are. That's a kind of foreboding line.
Uh huh.
Cloud, maybe she's right about this.
Dude,
Maybe
she's
they'll
been
let
through
Earth
enough,
know
dude.
once all is done.
Yeah.
This character obviously needs a
Maybe
break.
they're off waiting a little while.
Yeah, and then we know what happens later
Right.
with Ket
Back
Shi.
to Sector 7. Got things to take care
Yikes.
Jerk.
of. Like checking up on the bar.
I really do want to know what the inspiration for Barrett's tattoo is.
Okay.
I was looking at that, and honestly, I couldn't tell you what that thing is to begin with. But it would be nice to know.
Okay, let's just take a gander upstairs real quick.
In Sicily, I think, I don't know how to pronounce that. I'm sorry. I'm bad at that. You'll come to find out. But in Before Crisis, they actually, and in Crisis Core, they actually show that Sung has his hair in a bun. And that the reason why he lets his hair down is actually significant to his character development, which makes the inclusion of like the older model in that flashback a little not distressing, but it's just like, oh, come on, guys. Like, it would just be interesting to see like that part of Sung represented a little bit better.
So, so this is about as far as I can go tonight, and because I want to dedicate a whole stream to Deep Ground, with you, if you don't mind.
Thank God, yes.
Because
you know I would be down for that.
Because I'm gonna need to pause to let you describe it, each detail a lot, you know, because it's a big subject, and not a lot of people want to go all the way into a game that's really hard to get your hands on, or you know, try and just piece together a YouTube experience to figure out what's going on. So I do want to do that. Real quick, I just wanted to talk about a couple of things that I just sort of mentioned to you, Sleepezi, and it's so, you know, part of my background is scholastically I while attaining while going for my master's in philosophy, I did Hebrew studies, and just because I had a passing fascination with the Kabbalah and mysticism, and not for any real like belief reasons. Just I find it fascinating, and so I'm, I collected some friends that were, mythology guys and stuff like that. So I've been looking at kind of mythology stuff related to Final Fantasy, and one of the things is just some base background information on a couple of points. And that's that, a lot of the mythology surrounding the Cetra, there's these mythological ties, and they all seem to be mythology of antiquity. We're talking about Mesopotamian, Eastern mythologies, like even Hindi mythology. Shiva is by the way, Shiva is generally considered male, and I don't want to say mythology, in religion, in the Hindi religion. And then Ifrit is technically part of an Abrahamic religion, but it's a reference to it's a specific, like, older reference to a jinn or a genie that just happens to show up most recently in the Quran, and like some of the Hadith, which is the Islam oral tradition, and so these we know are sort of creations of the Cetra, and there's all these other ties. It seems like Minerva is a very strong tie to the Cetra, although there is an interesting point. I will get to it. So most of these are like old mythologies, and there's a lot of mythological symbolism with Yggdrasil and just general antiquated mythologies, things that we and our current human world consider to have passed from the line of religion to mythology. Now, the symbolism for everything associated with Genova, however, seems to be tied pretty explicitly to Abrahamic religion. Genova itself being sort of analogous to Jehovah, which is a mistranslation, an 1800s mistranslation of Yahweh, or Ein Sof, or God, or I am, or the Elohim, depending on what book you're looking at, and so Genova, this alien calamity, seems to represent that. Then we've got the heralds. We've got these angelic imagery associated with all the Genova quote unquote servants. The angels, which literally means like a messenger or a servant. And we've got Sephiroth, meaning literally the emanations of the Kabbalah. There's 10 or 11 depending on what school you're at. Most drawings show 11, but technically 2 of the emanations are two sides of 1, and so it's 10. So the 10 Sephiroth are where we derive or where probably the source material for Sephiroth's name came from. Throw in the 6-winged angel, which seems to have a lineup that mirrors the Kabbalic Sephiroth perfectly. Safer Sephiroth, meaning could be either Sephir, which is sort of a emanation or a expression of, like, the knowledge of, or Seraph, which happens to be a 6-winged celestial being, highlighted in the Bible.
And not to stop the train that you're going on, but for those who are wondering, it's not just Safer Sephiroth that has that 6-winged depiction.
Right.
Omega also has, who is the light represented entity in Dirge of Cerberus, the final weapon.
Yeah.
Also depicts with 6 wings, and also the wheel on Minerva's back also depicts.
And that's
6.
what I'm getting to very last. because there's another element about Minerva that is fascinating in this regard. So, and then we've got Genesis, which is obviously the book of Genesis, which is where most of these terms that we've mentioned come from, with the exception of seraphim. The Angel, is straight up like angel. Not a lot of subtlety there. What is odd though is that Minerva, who we have been sort of represented, like we have a lot of proof that she was either a Cetra or just heavily deep association with the Cetra. She's got the six-winged symbology too. Not only that, in the Japanese version, the model for her statue looked much more akin to the Virgin Mary. So much so that they had to change it to not offend us, the West. Us. I'm sorry, I'm not speaking for all of you, but Western Christianity. And so she seems bizarrely tied to these Abrahamic elements, and there's something to be said too, that there could be a parallel that the Abrahamic religions 2,000 years ago in our world sort of wiped out antiquity religions, meaning not like they eradicated them, but they just became the dominant religion, and our calendar is based on that. And there is something significant about the Gaian calendar that it seems to reset in 2,000-year cycles. So there's all these lines kind of drawn with calamity from the skies, meteor fall, Genova being these Western or the Abrahamic religions, which is Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. So there's this weird malice associated with Minerva. Like we were really not sure if she's good or bad. She has all this Cetra imagery, but she seems to be helping Genesis. She seems to have all this Christian imagery associated with her, despite being a literal, Roman or Etruscan god. Like that is what Minerva is in mythology. And then she's even got this depiction that makes her dead ass look like the Virgin Mary.
Right.
So throw all that in with, the six wings on her altar, and it does paint like the possibility of a narrative that we'll see, maybe expanded, that perhaps Minerva was one of the very first to fall under the influence of Genova. That's a possible connection to that, or at least that she shares a goal, or is supposed to represent, like that she's an agent of resetting the planet and maintaining the same kind of order. And we call the calamity from the skies alien because it does feel very alien, but a lot of the later lore seems to be making it seem more tied to the cyclical nature of the way the entire universe works. Like, that there's, it expands the idea of life stream beyond multiple planets. And so these are just bizarre musings, and I don't have like a theory or a prediction based off of those connections, but they're super interesting, especially as a mythology guy. So I'll let you talk for a bit, Sleepezi, and then we'll shut this baby down.
Yeah. Well, that's honestly this is definitely something that we haven't really brought up before.
Blindsided with you.
No, I love it. Like, I'm glad that you just dropped that on, because it's awesome. Something I'm going to second here to what you're saying is that in this depiction of 6 and 2, which, so just to like clarify, is that most entities that represent like good or some sort of like holy aspect in Final Fantasy 7 has the 6 wings. All right. So you have Minerva, you have Safer Sephiroth, you have Omega, and you have Minerva's wheel. Usually the counter argument to that is just a normal angel with 2 wings is usually highlighted as the opposite of, meaning like Chaos, for instance, only has 2 devil wings. Then you have, I'm trying to think of the other one that I just had in my mind and kind of just flew out. But the one thing I would say about Minerva and Sephiroth, especially in the depiction of the last bit of the game in OG, is that Sephiroth has 2 forms. We have Rebirth Sephiroth, which is also known in America as Bizarro.
Yeah.
Bizarro Sephiroth, who is depicted as having these 2 wings instead of arms. And then you also have a similar depiction in Genova. We are not 100% clarified that she does have 2 wings, but she does have these like nubs of wings that could have possibly been there. And then it's also represented in the Genova doll,
right,
as a similarity. And if you guys go ahead and look at like Genova doll and Rebirth Sephiroth, their forms, they're actually incredibly similar, down to like they both have the same placement in their core. They have the 2 wings as arms sort of represented. So those 2 forms of Sephiroth are, and perhaps because of Genova, represented in those 2 places. The one thing I did want to say though is that Minerva does have more wings on her than just the wheel. The wheel depicts the 6,
right,
but in a garb that she is never depicted in concept art, she actually has 2 wings coming out of like her waist.
right.
That separates her model, but then obviously like you could also like better bring that forward by using the color association in her concept art and in the model that we see her in the Genesis Minerva scene with her tiara having those 2 representations of color. Which is another thing that I didn't really mention is that most of those 6 winged creatures either have an association with the color green or they have an association with like yellow of some sort. And the same thing goes for the 2 winged creatures, which is that there's either a purple connection or something else. I'm incredibly interested to see like in the future how they decide to handle any of that information, if at all. But it's definitely interesting to get the perspective of how, especially because like as you mentioned, there's like a direct correlation between Sephiroth's name and like this particular aspect of this one religion, and how that all kind of forms together. Yeah, it's incredible, and that's something that I didn't really know about you before coming into this, is that fact that you've like studied it, like, and it's definitely going to take me a little bit of time to like digest more information based off of those mythologies. It's easier for me to go to Norse just because like I looked into it for like an entire video, but for like the Kabbalah and all this other stuff, there's a lot going on there, obviously, as far as borrowed elements.
Right. And I mean, so in what's there is, and you know, the main thing that I when you mentioned the tree of life, you know, that
Yggdrasil, yeah.
And we've talked about Yggdrasil too, but there is a tree of life in so many different spiritualities and in religions, and so the Sephiroth are the tree of life. And
Right.
there's something called the Clonophoth, which is an anti-tree of life. There's a tree of death too, and I'd be really interested to see if we ever get a depiction of that, because
That'd be awesome.
to me that will be, and I've been looking at Omega as a possible, because there's a similar diagram, and I've been looking at Omega to see if there's a possible parallel between those two, and so far I've not really concluded that, but I'll keep looking. But with that, I actually I can't thank all of you enough. If you haven't already followed, I'd appreciate it. But more importantly, I want you all to go to my go to the Twitch page, and there in the about section there's a link to Sleepezi's channel. Please subscribe to that, and watch all of his videos if you haven't. He puts out top notch content, and I think the best, most interesting, engaging remake content that you can get, and so please support his desire and motivation to continue making that, because his title, the subtitle of his video series is what the collection of five, or the theory of five, story of five, the structure of five, and he's on his fourth video. His fourth video came out like 3 weeks ago, so he's got to at least get it to five. So please everybody help him do that, and then maybe he can make the structure of like 27 next.
And just on that note as well, I would like to thank everybody for being here, and then also just in general, Baby Seal for conducting all of this and orchestrating all of it. And yeah, just give him a follow, and yeah, support his channel as well, because I love being here. I love talking to you guys, and I especially love this engaging conversation that you keep bringing to the table, Baby Seal. So it's been an absolute pleasure, and I hope everybody has a good night. Thank you for being here, guys.
Good night, guys.